It was summer in Appalachia, and I, for one, couldn't be happier. The sun had melted, the critters were beginning to be more in evidence, and Grandpa, too, had come out of his hibernation of sorts. It was good to see him in the garden again, planting his vegetables, walking the woods, talking about fishing and hiking again. I'd often joked that Grandpa was part bear, and this was just him waking up after a long sleep to start his yearly adventures. Adventures that kicked off right away, it seemed. I woke up to the harsh sound of dragging one morning and looked out my window to find Grandpa pulling a large wooden trough across the ground. It looked more like a canoe than a trough, and I wondered how he had gotten it this far. I had seen it a dozen times, but I assumed it was a throwback to when the farmhouse had been an actual farm. It was long, made of sturdy cedar, and it looked like it weighed about a ton. Grandpa seemed to be pulling it along quite easily, but the backpack he was wearing seemed to be griping him some. I pulled on my jeans and my boots and went down to help him. It was too hot to even think about a light jacket, and as I stepped outside, the mountains kissed my cheek with a hot breath. "What you doing, Gramps?" I asked, coming around the house to see if I could help. "Oh, just my summer offering to the Sasquatch." I was dumbfounded for a moment, and it must have showed. "Didn't I tell you already how I ran up on a Bigfoot while drunk?" he asked, grunting as he pulled the trough. "Maybe," I hedged, picking up the other end. "You tell me so many things, Grandpa, it's hard to keep track of all of them." Grandpa laughed. "Well, I hope you're keeping track of them, because they are all very important." If only he knew. I'd been writing a little book of Grandpa's stories just so I wouldn't forget any of them. Gramps was one of the hardiest old guys I knew, but he was still an old man, and I knew my time with him would be limited. I wanted something to show my kids when he was gone, and Grandpa's stories were such a huge part of who he was. "So, you met a Bigfoot, huh?" I said, readjusting my grip on the wooden trough. "Yes, indeed. It was one of the scariest times of my life, in fact." "You want to tell me about it?" I asked. Grandpa shrugged, but seemed to regret it when the trough shifted a little and he bumped a spruce. I suppose it's not a very long story, and comes down to a time I was doing something I shouldn't have been, drinking in the woods. This was a while after I'd come back from Alaska, you understand. I had gotten work with a trucking company in Franklin and was their go-to guy for practically everything, especially difficult deliveries. My bosses learned that I used to drive truck in the frozen north, as they always called it, and decided they would put me on routes that would test my skills. I was gone a lot, sometimes for weeks at a time, but your grandma always kept the house and had a hot meal ready when I got back. Usually after a long trip, I would take some time off so we could spend it together, and in that way, we survived. This was about 3 years after I'd come back, and I was preparing for a long trip to North Dakota when she got a phone call from her aunt, who was sick and needed a hand. Now, her aunt lived in Philadelphia, not quite as far off as Alaska, but a little stretch nonetheless. So she decided to take a bus up there and see if she could be of help. I told her that was fine, seeing as I was getting ready to head out myself, and drove her to the bus station, where she kissed me goodbye and said she'd see me in a week or two. This was a time when family went to help each other like this often, and I knew she'd be safe with her cousins. I had just slung my bag into the truck when the phone rang inside, and I managed to catch it on the 5th ring. "Bad luck, Rusty," said the boss. "The clients pulled out, said they were gonna have to file for bankruptcy. I'll call you if something comes up, but I think you've got some paid leave coming anyway, so just consider this your vacation unless something comes up on an emergency basis." So I was left alone with my thoughts, which translated to a 12-pack on the back porch as I watched the wind make the trees dance. It hadn't occurred to me until then, but 4 beers in, I remembered just what day it was. It was the anniversary of the lights taking my friends from me, and the melancholy that settled over me was sudden and unshakable. I wondered what it would be like to have them here, all of us sitting on the porch and drinking beers and talking about the old times. I glanced at the porch, and suddenly I could see them there like ghosts. They were smoking, drinking, and laughing at something that I couldn't hear, and I realized that to them I was the ghost. They had all moved on, somewhere I couldn't follow, and I was the ghost that haunted their what-ifs. Suddenly it was more than I could take, and I grabbed the last of my beer, adding a few more from the fridge just to make it an even 10, and went for a walk. The house was too quiet, too crowded with silent specters, and I needed to clear my head. The woods had always been a place I went to think, but I might have been a little drunker than I meant to be that day, and what began as a walk became a session of aimless wandering. I kept drinking, not wanting the ghost to follow me, but even as drunk as I was, I could still feel something following behind me. It wasn't no ghost, not by a long shot, but it was still enough to put my hackles up. I could hear it moving through the woods just out of sight, following me as I went deeper into the woods than ever before. The eyes felt unkind, hateful even, and my teeth chattered, heedless of my wishes. When it loosed a growl at me, the sound like thunder, I started running. The ground thumped beneath me as I ran, my feet tripping and thumping over rocks and roots, and the something behind me thumped right along with me. Something that big had no right being that agile, and when I went down, my foot catching on a root, I winced as I crashed into the loamy earth. The cans rattled in the cotton I'd been carrying them in, and a few of them scattered across the ground as I turned to face whatever had been chasing me. I had expected a lot of things, a bear or a cougar, but the last thing I expected was a 7-foot-tall mountain of fur looking down at me like it meant to kill me with a stare. He was huge, a towering thing with hands the size of hubcaps. His face was nestled at the top of him, peeking through tangled fur, and when he screamed at me, I wet myself for the first time in a long time. For a moment, we just stayed still, looking at each other like we were waiting for the other to make a move. Then, the big fella looked at something on the ground beside me, and the shiny can caught his eye. He bent down, something that looked like it might give me vertigo, and picked it up between his thumb and forefinger. It looked tiny in his hand, and he sniffed at it before opening his mouth like he meant to bite it. "No, hey," I said, and he snorted like a gorilla and turned back towards me. I started to shut up and just let him bite it, but I guess I was filled with what my dad used to call liquid courage, 'cause I kept going. I lifted one of the cans from the carton, showing it to him before popping the tab. The thing took a step back, yelling again something fierce, and when I could stop my eardrums from rattling, I showed him it was open and tipped the can to my mouth. "See? The liquid's inside, but you'll cut your mouth if you bite the can." He looked at the can in his hand, and I saw the problem right away. His thumbs were not going to be able to open it, not on his best day, and as he studied it, I held my can out to him instead. "Here," I said, "trade ya." He thought about it and finally took the can and handed me the t'other one. He tilted the can and seemed to pour most of it on himself as opposed to in his mouth. Whatever he got in him, he must have liked, because he nodded and reached for the one that he had handed me. I popped the top for him, something he understood now, and passed it up. He drank that one too, and soon I was popping cans and passing them to him as quickly as I was able. He would drink 'em, crush 'em between his thumb and forefinger, and then reach for another one. It wasn't long before I had passed him the 8 beers I had left, and that seemed to make him angry. He stomped a little when I spread my arms and showed him the empty carton, and his roar shook the trees at their tops. "Now hang on, I can get more," I told him, holding my hands up to placate him. "I have more at my house. House, you know, house?" I asked, making a childish version in the dirt. The creature looked at it and nodded, looking at me with hope. "Follow me," I said, now sober as a bird and just not wanting to get my head caved in by an angry whatever this was. We went back through the woods, his steps sounding like thunder, and we came back to the house much sooner than I would have thought. Turned out I hadn't been as deep as I'd thought I had been. Probably a lot of drunken stumbling instead of actual hiking. Creature looked around like he thought I might have more beer sitting on the lawn, and I realized my mistake. I pointed to a nearby stump and told him to sit, promising I'd be right back. He sat, but he seemed distrusting of me, and I knew I wouldn't have long before he came in after me. Luckily, I had something a little stronger than PBR in the cabinet. Dad had been a good farmer, but he'd been an even better moonshiner. The shed we now used to store tools was once where Dad kept his still, and he had about 8 big cartoonish jugs of pure corn whiskey in the cabinet. Purely for medicinal purposes, he would say, but I think, even as a child, I knew better. I grabbed 2 of the ceramic jugs and brought them out to the yard. My guest was still there, seeming pleased when I came back, and I pulled the stopper out and tilted the neck of the bottle to my lips to show him how it was done. He was hesitant, not sure he really trusted me, but when he took that first sip, I knew I was going to have to get more whiskey. He had the first jug drained in about 5 minutes, putting a hand out for the t'other as I went to get more. At some point, I started drinking with him, and when I woke up in the yard the next day, he had drunk all 8 jugs and left me with a splitting hangover and a monster-sized divot in the yard where he had slept it off. We had put the trough down between 2 well-worn rocks, and as Grandpa opened the pack, I saw he had about 8 jugs of white lightning and a huge bottle of malt liquor. He started dumping it into the trough, and soon I was helping him. "So, why do you keep bringing him booze then?" "Well, he showed up a few days later wanting more, and I had to go get some from town before he had a tantrum. After a while, it became too much to maintain, and how was I going to hide him from your grandma when she got back? So I sat him down and showed him a diagram. I told him when the moon changes 8 times, I would leave him a whole trough of liquor in the woods. It took some explaining, but he finally got it, and we've done it like that ever since." We were just dumping the last of the liquor in when I started hearing thunderous footsteps in the distance. "Stand back a little, boy. He can be skittish, so I'll introduce you." I leaned against a tree, hearing the thunder get closer and closer, until I saw a massive, hairy Sasquatch come lumbering from the woods. It smiled as much as it could smile, and wrapped Grandpa in a hug that looked distinctly gentle. It seemed to understand that he was old and a little frail, but the smile disappeared when it saw me. Now, Grandpa said, putting a hand on his chest. "I brought someone to meet you. This is my grandson. He's a friend, so be nice." The Sasquatch looked at me, nodding his head a single time, and dipped down to drink from the trough. "We should go," Grandpa said. "He'll be at this a while, and he isn't one for conversation anyway." I never dreamed when I got up that day that I would drag a wooden canoe into the woods, fill it with liquor, and meet a Sasquatch. But that's one of the perks about living with Grandpa, I guess. You just never know what each day might bring. Dex was up, looking for the source of the scream before he was fully awake. He knew who was screaming, and Dunstan was on his way from the other side of the room too, as the other kids started waking up. Masha was thrashing around, her covers snaked around her legs and arms, screaming as she fought against the imaginary enemies. The other kids were standing around, not sure what to do, but this was Dex's nightly routine at this point. He pulled the blankets around her, making her into a human burrito, and shushed her as he rocked. Dex was aware of how ridiculous he looked, but he didn't care. Masha wasn't getting enough sleep, and it was starting to show. "I swear it's every night now," Dunstan said, sitting down next to him as he soothed her. "She's gonna miss class at this rate if—" "Hey, you guys think you can keep your friend from screaming?" came a familiar snide voice. "She's keeping all the normal people awake." They glowered over at Chandra, her bed still next to the little girl's, and she put her hands up and rolled over. Despite being kept up, Dex didn't think she looked all that tired. Chandra appeared to be getting enough sleep, despite the nightly screaming sessions, and that was surprising. Must be nice, he thought, to be able to function off a few hours. "Catch some Z's done," Dex said. "I'll lay with her tonight." "You sure? You did it last night, too. I don't mind taking a shift." "I'm sure. They just need my body for training. Your mind and her mind need to be sharp for lessons. Get some sleep. I got this." Dunstan nodded, heading back to bed as Dex tried to get comfortable in the little girl's tiny bed. The bed was hardly large enough for one normal-sized person, and Dex found it difficult to get comfortable with so little space. He was tired, but the frame pushed at him in painful ways as he tried to settle. Masha was snoring already, the nightmares gone, but Dex doubted this would be the last one tonight. "Gonna come keep me company next, big fella?" Chandra teased. "I'm sure I could make some room for you." Dex gave her the finger and she rolled over, cackling like a hen as his eyes got heavy. The nightmares had started about a week ago, and they weren't getting any better. After 2 nights, Dex had suggested that she talk with the minders about it, but they were no help. They had suggested more activity before bed, changing her diet, even that it was a result of her powers beginning to grow, but their solutions offered nothing but more of the same. Dex didn't know what to do, but it was starting to affect everyone. He had seen some dark looks thrown Masha's way, and even their little circle of friends had cast unfriendly eyes on her. She let out a muffled moan as she shifted in her swaddling blanket, and Dex held her tight until she stilled. He had to get some sleep. Class started in 3 hours, and it would be another day of exercise. He was snoring before he knew it, and thankfully, Masha managed to sleep through the night. She almost cried as her hand struck the glass of juice and sent it spilling across the table. Dunstan couldn't even be mad about it, and they got it cleaned up pretty quickly. "I'm sorry. I'm so clumsy." "No, you're exhausted," Dex said. "You need to talk to the minders and get some sleep. You can't keep going like this." "You guys do," Masha said, stifling a yawn as she missed her mouth with a forkful of eggs. "You and Dunstan get up every time I have a nightmare, so the least I can do is push through this." Dex sipped the coffee he'd gotten, wondering if there was a way he could take it with him. He was better at hiding it, but he was just as tired as Masha. Dex was sort of used to being tired, though. So much of living on the street had been sleeping somewhere till they put you out, at least until they found the clubhouse. There had been periods where he would snatch an hour here, a couple of hours there, and then get back on the move again so the cops didn't catch them. Do you remember what the dreams are about, at least? Dunstan asked, not for the first time. What's it matter? Dex asked, trying to keep the exasperation out of his voice. If we knew what caused it, maybe we can fix it. Doesn't matter anyway. I don't remember them. It's like they come on so quickly that I just can't remember what they're about. I'm sorry, guys. I know this has got to be annoying. It's cool, Dex said. We'll get through this. The bell rang as they walked off, Britt and Jenny saying they would keep an eye on her. But Dex stopped Dunstan. Need a favor, he said, Ryan waiting by the door for him as Dunstan looked at the bigger boy questioningly. If you need me to sit with her tonight, that ain't it. I want you to talk to Dr. Hammershoal about her dreams. Dunstan's face scrunched a little more. The little doctor? You think he can help? Man, I hope so. I'm getting pretty ragged, and I can see she is too. She needs some relief, some sleep, something, or she's going to start breaking down. We need answers. If he has them, then we need his help. Dunstan thought about it, nodding as he thought about the skills the doctor had said he'd had in his time here. I'll ask, Dunstan said, and the two bumped fists as they headed off towards their daily trials. Rebecca winced as the scent of evergreen filled her nose. This was how they had decided to test her abilities, since she couldn't just manifest visions on demand. Well, this was one of them. It had started with different colors, then color patterns, sounds, a brain scan, certain words and phrases, more sounds, another brain scan, and now smells. They had a bunch of those plastic film canisters, and she was instructed to take the lid off and inhale deeply to see if it elicited a reaction. So far, nothing, but Rebecca was hopeful. If this didn't work, then the minders had mentioned chemical trials, and Rebecca was a little afraid that they would turn her into a zombie or a speed freak or something. She wondered if Dr. Hammershoal had anything to do with this, and that filled her with an old anger. The little doctor had been very careful not to get too close to her, and never to be alone with her. He could clearly see how angry she was at him, blamed him for her being here, and with good reason. It was his fault, she felt certain of it, and if she ever got the chance, she'd take that anger out on the tiny man. She coughed as the smell of cigarettes assaulted her, shaking her head as she tried to catch her breath. She'd had visions in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived, but they had been different from the ones back at school. Those dreams, or visions, or whatever, had been about her. These visions had been about the kindergarten. In them, she was like a ghost or something, floating around and observing people as they went about their day-to-day lives. She saw herself a few times as she walked with Gerald, and watching them move filled her with a deep and unquenchable hunger. It was strange to watch them walking, talking, thinking, living, and also feel the drool as it ran down your chin. Anything? Asked the minder, making notes on her clipboard as Rebecca smelled. Just a headache. Cigarettes always make me feel a little nauseous. She said, scribbling something. Gerald, are you having any luck? Gerald shrugged, not really sure what to tell her. Not really. Strings are still there, and the blue one just stretches off through the wall. She nodded, flipping a page and making another note. Rebecca picked up another one and smelled. Yuck. Trash can water. She gagged a little as she put it down, not really sure what they were looking for here. You know, Rebecca said, sometimes there is a smell before it happens. Yeah? The minder said, looking intently. It's like the smell before a lightning strike, I guess. It's hard to... Ozone? I guess, she said, not really knowing the word. Maybe that's something we can work with, the minder said, more to herself than Rebecca. Rebecca thought back to the dreams or visions she'd had last night, and wondered what the lady would make of those. It had been another one of those floaty dreams, but her course took her through the empty halls, as opposed to the full ones. She floated through the dark game room, the cafeteria, the library, and finally to the dormitories. She had heard the little girl screaming from the hallway, and when she came swooping in, she saw the little bundle of bedclothes writhing on her mattress. There was a red crown around her head, a dancing neon halo of terribleness, and she woke up suddenly to hear the little girl being comforted by her friends. Maybe it meant something, maybe it didn't, but Rebecca supposed there had to be something to it, or why would it show it? "Ma'am," Gerald said, and the minder looked up hopefully. "May I go to the bathroom?" Her face fell. "Yeah, Gerald, go ahead." He gave Rebecca a strange look as he left, but she put it out of her mind. Whatever he was actually up to, she supposed he would tell her later. She went back to her smells, hoping for one that would give her some control over this strange and often frightening ability. "Okay, Dunstan, what do you see?" "There's a field. He's playing baseball. No, not baseball. It's just catch. He and another kid are playing catch. The kid is his friend. No, it's more than that. They're dating? Boyfriends? I don't know, but he likes the other boy a lot." Dunstan hadn't really wanted to touch the glove, but as the vision started, he had slipped it on and was popping his fist into the pocket of the glove as he saw more. "They're kissing now. Gross. But they like it. They like each other, and to them, it's good. They have to be careful. If someone sees them, then they could be in trouble. But now someone has seen them, and he's shouting at them." "Who is it?" Hammarskjöld asked. "Who sees them?" He's a priest. No, a minister. He's a minister for the boys' church. The boys, Presbyterian. That's not right, but I don't know the word." "Presbyterian?" the little doctor supplied, and Dunstan nodded. Yeah, I think that's it. The minister, he's real angry. He says the boys are sinning, and he says they're going to burn in hell if they don't repent. The other boy, Micah, his name is Micah. He gets angry. He's bigger than the boy with the glove, 14 and muscled, and he walks over and pushes the minister. He threatens to hurt the minister. Father Gabriel is the minister's name. He pushes him down, telling him to leave them alone. Then Dunstan's eyes went far away, but Hammarskjöld jumped a little when he flinched. What happened? The minister, Father Gabriel, he shot Micah. Micah fell down, and he didn't get back up. The minister panicked. He hadn't meant to kill him, but now... Dunstan shuddered again, crying out as he popped his fist into the glove faster. He shot the boy with the glove, too. Then what happened? Hammarskjöld asked. He needed to know so he could get some justice for those boys. He buried them in the field. He buried them deep. The glove slipped off the kid's hand when he died, and the man who found it, he couldn't find them because they were buried so deep. They never suspected the minister. He showed up to help look, but he knew where they were all along. He knew why. Why didn't he tell? Why didn't he just tell? Dunstan was crying. His sightless eyes were weeping freely, and Hammarskjöld took the glove off him and threw it back onto the desk. Dunstan shook again and looked around, finally finding the little man as he wiped his eyes. I don't like this game. I never see anything nice. It's always terrible stuff. I know, Dr. Hammarskjöld said, but now I can get justice for those boys and make sure that man never hurts anyone else again. Won't do any good. There will always be another one. Another dead kid, another hurt person, another man just looking for someone to put in the ground. Dr. Hammarskjöld started to pat his hand, but thought better of it. God only knew what Dunstan could get if he touched him. Think of it as a service to the dead, then. That boy's family can have some closure, and he can be put to rest."
Dunstan nodded. I think I need to visit the bathroom. Did you have anything else for me today?"
Hammarskjöld checked his watch. It was nearly lunchtime, and he shook his head at how time flew. It seemed he had just finished breakfast, but it was nearly noon, and they had solved 3 missing persons cases and 2 murders. Quite a day already. "No, you can take the rest of the day off if you need to. Check with the minder and make sure there's nothing else." Dunstan nodded and left through the side door. Hammarskjöld had another of his experiments with the string boy, Gerald, later, and he was curious to see what could be made of it. They had tried some mazes, but the results had been mixed. He could avoid dangers well enough, but he couldn't follow the strings to any particular target. They really just seemed to lead him to his destination, but they were constant in that direction. Hammarskjöld saw no real utility in them, other than leading Gerald to whatever his final destination was. Hammarskjöld sighed. He hoped it wasn't leading him towards being just another item on this table, for Dunstan to read like a book of secrets. Gerald heard the door open and tried to pluck up his courage. The purple string was still firmly jutting from the door, and he could see it following the boy in the sneakers as he approached the urinal. It was Dunstan, it had to be, but he didn't know how to begin to tell him what he knew. Gerald didn't even know if he should tell him, but he knew it was information he needed. Gerald had heard something interesting, and he knew it would solve the problems Dunstan and his friends were having. He and Rebecca had been in the library yesterday when it happened. Rebecca was working her way through Eclipse, the vampire books that had her attention lately, and Gerald was looking for something to hold his own interest. The strings weren't much use when it came to picking books, and he was stalking the shelves when he overheard a conversation that the speakers were trying to keep away from the others. "Why don't you just say you're sorry and come be part of the group too?" someone was whispering. Whoever they were whispering to had scoffed. "Apologize? Apologize for what? She comes in here and thinks she's such hot shit. I haven't done anything to say sorry for." "It would bring peace, Chandra. You could come be part of our group instead of being alone all the time. We don't hate you, but you have to let go of this crap with Masha." "I don't think so. But when she kicks you both to the curb, I guess you can come be my friends again." "Whatever, Chandra. We tried to be nice, but if you're going to be like this, then we don't want to be any part of it." They had walked away, not even noticing him there, and when Chandra had whispered to herself, it was almost too low to catch. "See if you want to be friends with her when she's a drooling vegetable. A couple more nights without sleep, and she'll be nutso." Gerald had checked, and sure enough, the red string running towards her had let him know that the girl with the platinum hair was dangerous. He had thought about it long and hard, and now Gerald thought for sure that Chandra was the one sending the dreams. He didn't understand why, but he rarely understood why people did what they did. She was a bully, he supposed, and she really didn't need a good reason. Chandra didn't like Masha, felt she had stolen her friends, and she meant to have them back, even if it cost a little girl her sanity. He heard the water running in the sink and realized it was now or never. He opened the door and found himself eye to eye with the boy, Dunstan having turned to leave as Gerald came out. Dunstan jumped a little, clearly not expecting anyone else to be in here, and laughed as he looked at Gerald's somber face. "Jeez, you scared me. I didn't know anyone else was in here. It's all yours if you need the sink. I was just..." "No, sorry," Gerald started, not really sure how to begin. "I was actually hoping to talk with you." Dunstan kept his smile in place, but it looked a touch unsure of itself. "Well, you picked a heck of a place for it. Must be pretty important to ambush a guy in the can." Gerald closed his eyes, collecting his thoughts before he blew this. This was important, maybe the most important thing he would do with his life, and he couldn't let it slip by. The purple string had him unsure of himself in a way that he rarely was, but he had to power through it. "I know something about your friend, the little girl, and why she's having nightmares." "Oh?" Dunstan said, his smile turning into something less than friendly. "Well, if you've got some idea, I'd love to hear it. I know she's keeping you guys awake too, but if it's another question about why we can't just gag her, then just..." "No," Gerald said. I think I know what's causing it, and I want to hear what you think about it." Dunstan nodded, opening the bathroom door and holding it open for him. "Just so happens I have the afternoon off, and given that you were skulking in a bathroom, I can assume that you don't have anything particularly pressing either. Let's take a walk. You can tell me all about it." He and Gerald went to the media room, Gerald telling him what he suspected, and Dunstan putting the pieces together. By the time the bell rang for lunch, Dunstan had a pretty good idea of what they had to do, foremost among them being taking Gerald to the lunch table so he could talk it over with his friends. Joseph and I walked through the shadowy, smelly halls of the sewer, our guide moving ahead of us excitedly. I had started out with the leash, trying to keep a handle on the thing as it tested the limits of my control. The constant little chuckles echoed off the wall like rat feet, and it turned its head fitfully as it took the sewers like a bloodhound. Wherever it was going, it seemed to know the way, and it wanted to get there as quickly as possible. After watching me struggle with the thing, Joseph had finally just taken the leash and seemed to have an easier time handling it. "So," I said, as the tunnel stretched out before us, "how did it all come to this? You guys living underground, I mean." "Believe it or not, it started with the farmer's market." "Really?" I asked, not sure I believed him. "Well, not really, but it really took off after the farmer's market was established. I guess it started with that weird group moving into the old McCurdy ranch. Charles McCurdy had sold 300 acres out at the edge of town, and we had all expected to see a dairy farm or maybe a turkey farm take over the old place and breathe life into the town again. Instead, we got a bunch of Amish-looking people who showed up on the first day of the farmer's market in wooden wagons like old-timey pioneers. They had jams, jellies, quilts, vegetables, even some animals. They were a big hit, though no one knew that they had such a stock of goods after being on the property for less than a month. Our shackled guide sniffed left and right as we came to another divide and took another right. "When did they start to change?" I asked, knowing there would be a change a-comin'. "It didn't take long. I worked with the emergency service line, and in Tyler, I dispatched fire, police, and medical. We started getting calls about weird people walking through people's yards at night, strange break-ins that resulted in calls back later telling us that it had been nothing, reports of strange chanting, just weird stuff that had never been a problem in Tyler before then. The people they reported, individuals in homespun dresses and suspenders, sounded a lot like the people who had came to every opening of the farmer's market, and the police started wondering if the new residents of the farm had ulterior motives. Maybe they were religious nuts bent on recruiting. Maybe they were just interested in taking people and forcing them to accept their weird religion. Maybe the people just didn't want them around, and this was their way of getting rid of them. Whatever the case, the reports started coming in less and less, but the ones that did come in were just disturbing. People would go missing when they went to investigate. The people who had called in just the day before to report strangers on their property were suddenly manning the stalls at the farmer's market, selling jams and jellies and quilts. They had changed, been indoctrinated, and nothing could bring them back. He stopped talking as our guide sped up, getting down to run on all fours as It made its way towards the end of the tunnel. It took no notice of the filth that was running through, and I winced as its hands came down in something dark and soft. It was too filthy, the two of us running along behind it as it took the corners seemingly at random. When it turned left, I was left squinting at the emergency lights at the end of the tunnel. I knew we were getting close to escaping the cramped, smelly underground then. We came out of a large, ridged tube that was leaking water into a dirty culvert. The ditch stretched into a shaggy grassland, the timothy grass swaying in the phantom breeze, and I could see the sun making its slow trek towards the bottom of the horizon. It was about 3, I figured, and we had some daylight ahead of us. Fortunately, the tube wasn't very high off the ground, because the chained thing jumped into the muddy ditch, and Joseph and I were forced to go after it. We both plunged into knee-deep mud as we made our way through the ditch, and I asked how that led to them living like the Morlocks. Well, at first, we were staying in the hospital. Dr. Margot had sort of taken charge of the people in the hospital who hadn't changed, and we were hunkered down as the town transformed. The people who had been indoctrinated had gone to the farm, a farm that was no longer exactly where it should be, but now they were coming back to take the town, and those left behind. We had locked all our doors. The Bright followers were too weak to break through. But one night, we had something different try to get in. We saw flashing lights and realized there were cop cars parked by the ER door. James and 2 other officers were out there, and they begged us to let them in before the Bright followers could get them. After some discussion, Margot let them in, and she asked where the rest of the police department was. Turned out, James and these 2 officers were all that was left of the sheriff's department. They'd gone with Sheriff Wheeler, the old sheriff, to the Bright compound, wanting to rescue the people they had taken. They'd gone in with 15. Jacob and the other 2 were the only ones left. They had taken over the town, and Jacob said they were making their way to the hospital in force. It was okay, though, because he had a plan that would see all of us put somewhere safe. We came out of the ditch into the overgrown area between the farmlands. It was all fences and croplands as far as I could see, and Jacob kept looking around like the farm we were looking for would just appear. The thing on the leash was having the time of its life, plowing into the tall grass like a shark on the prowl for fish. It was taking us towards the outskirts, heading unerringly east as we headed for God knew what. He took Margot into the basement and showed her the sewer entrance. All the older buildings had one, maintenance hatches that helped with upkeep on the ancient sewer tunnels beneath Tyler, and it just so happened that he had the key. It's impossible to get into the tunnels without the key, he told her, so once we go down, we should be safe. There weren't a lot of us, maybe 40 or 50 people, and we stripped a lot of stuff from the hospital before disappearing into the sewers. It's been a couple of years since then, and though we lost a lot of people to the Bright, we endure. We were wading through the grass, and I expected that any minute now, one of us would come down on a snake or a hornet's nest, and we'd be really screwed. Whatever the smiling thing was, however, it didn't seem to have any fear. It was heading straight for something, and I had a feeling it knew right where the farm was. "But how much longer can you hold out?" I asked, dodging around brambles as we jogged through the unkempt field. "Why not leave and get help, or why not leave for good?" Jacob shrugged. Joseph only shrugged. Where would we go? Most of us don't have any money that's not wrapped up in the bank we can't go to. Our homes are here. Most of us can't just pick up and leave. We just stay and hope that things will change. "It's all we can do," he said, sounding less than hopeful. I hated that, the hopelessness that lingered in Joseph's voice. It was pretty clear that he didn't think they would ever get the town back, and here I was using them to find Bright farms so I could meet someone who just wanted another warm body for her church. As we walked through the field, I thought about letting this creature go and just telling Joseph to go home. What right did I have to use him for my own personal gains? In a way, I was just as selfish as the members of the church. Maybe I was right to seek them out. Kind calls to kind, after all. The sun had begun to dip, sunset on the horizon, when we crested a hill and saw it. It was just as it had been in the intro to the show, and my breath hitched in my throat as I looked down upon it. There was the general store, the white roof standing out amongst the other, more uniform buildings. There were a lot of tall, dark buildings behind it, the Wonder Barn, long and thin, like a cigar on its side, and the church as it sat with the woods at its back. The farm was surrounded by cropland and pasture, the whole thing ringed in by oaks and pines that looked like they'd been here for ages. The whole thing sat crouched like a sleeping cat, looking benign and inviting before the claws came out. When Joseph put the chain in my hand, I looked at him in confusion. "What? Aren't you coming with me?" "Not a chance. I brought you here. We found the place, but there isn't enough money in the state to make me go into that place with you." He was making his way back the way he'd come, and I couldn't help but feel a little miffed as he abandoned me. "You're just gonna let me go in by myself to face God only knows what?" He shrugged. "It's what you wanted, right? I just agreed to help you find the place." I had just reflected that at least I had the whatever it was to keep me company, when I was suddenly jerked forward and fell headfirst into the prickly shafts of that thick Timothy grass. My guide went charging into the tall grass, rushing down into the valley like an arrow fired from a bow. I tried to get up and give chase, but even as I ran after it, I knew I'd never catch him. He was on all fours, running flat out for the woods around the farm, and I was barely keeping him in sight. As the sun sank lower and night became more than an idea, I realized the futility of it and stopped to catch my breath. I didn't need him anyway. I knew where I was going, and I was closer than I had ever been. The sun had still been up as I stood at the top of the hill, but within the trees that surrounded the farm, it was the soupy dusk that comes before night. Everything seemed to shimmer, the shadows making the forest seem like a mirage. The air seemed too thick, too substantial, and I almost expected to bump into something as I came through the forest. It was like invisible things hunted me on the edge of my vision, and I had to stifle a shriek when a twig snapped not far from me. I wanted to bolt, to run through the woods like Snow White, but I needed to keep my head. The trees hadn't looked so numerous, and I knew I'd come out of them any minute. They ended as abruptly as they had begun, and I got low as I came to the edge of the road that led to the general store. I could see there in the distance the white roof at odds with the black wooden structures, and I breathed in an excited, terrified breath. I was here. I'd arrived. I'd come to Bright Farm. I wanted to run up to the building, to throw the door open and find my mother behind the counter, smiling in expectation. She would greet me, she would embrace me, and through some kind of hidden magic, I would convince her to come with me. She would leave the farm, we'd go back home, where we would live happily ever after, as a family. It was a happy daydream, but I still kept low and quiet as I approached, knowing that if anyone but my mom, and maybe Brother Thomas, saw me, then it would be very bad for me. I snuck up the road, not encountering anyone, and that seemed odd. The lights were out in the general store, and all the houses were dark and seemed uninhabited. Surely they didn't turn in this early, I thought. The sun wasn't even down all the way. And when I found the general store locked, I nearly cried out in despair. I'd come so far, I'd risked so much, and now they were gone. I didn't know where they were, but at that moment I was afraid they had simply picked up stakes and moved on. I was sitting on one of the rockers on the front porch when something made me squint and turn to look out into the field. There, coming from the doors of the chapel, was a bright line of light that seemed to be escaping through the crack in the center of the double doors. It was the only light to be seen, and despite the chapel being nearly a mile away, I could see it clear as sunrise. The windows were lit as well, though their light looked a little more muted than this all-intrusive bright emanation. Before I knew it, I was walking towards the chapel, my feet knowing the way, even if my brain hadn't caught up. I was stepping off the porch when the door opened, and I was left looking at a familiar form lifting a lantern towards me. "Angel, right on time," Brother Thomas said. "If you'd come with me, we'll get you to your mother." I felt a little like I needed a horse and shotgun for the work I was doing. Don't get me wrong, it was nice to have the extra hands, but as I walked the line of men in orange jumpsuits, watching as they weeded and hoed and generally performed upkeep on the garden, I half expected someone to tell me they were taking it off there, boss, or drinking the water there, boss, like in an old prison movie. They didn't, and that somehow felt even stranger. The bus had rolled up right about sunset, the fluorescents sparkling off the chains they wore. They had been cuffed at the ankles and wrists, and once they were in the park, the wrist cuffs would be removed. There wasn't a ball or a daisy chain of inmates to be seen, and that threw me a little bit too. I was used to movies like Shawshank Redemption or Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and these guys just looked like normal guys in orange jumpsuits. I don't know if I was expecting Cool Hand Luke and John Coffey to show up or something, but I was a little underwhelmed by the selection we had. Most of these guys just looked like they were happy to see the sky for a change. "Alright, listen up," said a beefy guy in a gray uniform. "You're here to work. You know that. 19:30 to midnight. You are here to do whatever is needed of you. At midnight, you will shuffle back onto the bus and return to Stragview. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," they all intoned. "If contraband should fall from the sky in front of you, you damn sure better leave it where it lies. You will be searched before you get back on the bus. You will be strip searched when you return to the prison. Anyone found with contraband will spend a month in confinement, see their gain time stripped, and will be removed from work squad. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir, boss," they intoned again. Geez, it was like they practiced or something. "You will receive time and a half on your gain time form, as well as $1 an hour for your work. So don't mess around. These men behind me will be your overseers, but they will be paired with an officer to make sure you are properly watched. And gentlemen," he added, grinning wickedly, "don't stray too far from your work area. This place has a reputation for losing people, and while I would hate to fill out the paperwork for a missing inmate, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. Right, break off. My group with me, Winkle's group with him." He turned then and offered a hand to Randy. "Sergeant Yates at your service. You head of security?" "Yeah," Randy said, trading grips with him. "Your groups will meet tonight. My second will go with Officer Winkle." Yates turned to shake my hand as well, and when a nervous-looking kid wandered up to tell Yates that the groups were ready, we set off. The groups were a little uneven, 12 and 13, and Winkle and I had the smaller one. The guys talked quietly amongst themselves, taking in the flower beds and the weird trees that seemed to bring the crowds in. But it was hard not to see the man who had run those paths a week ago. That had been something bad, something I hadn't liked being a part of, but I knew I'd do it again if called to do so. We put them to work weeding flower beds, giving particular instructions to not disturb the flowers, and they set to it. None of them had any tough guy questions or smart-ass retorts. These guys were pretty well behaved, all things considered, and I suppose that made sense. You don't bring your troublemakers out into public, and as they set to their work, Winkle leaned against a wall and made chit-chat. "So, do you and Randy work as night guards?" he asked, the smoke curling from his cigarette. "Yeah," I told him, not technically a lie, since we worked security 24/7. It's pretty dead here at night, so we usually just patrol and watch cameras. Sounds like a sweet gig, Winkle said, exhaling smoke into the night air. They hiring? I think we're fully staffed at the moment, but couldn't hurt to put an application in. He nodded, looking at the group as I watched him do a quick head count. This seemed ingrained into them, and I'd seen Yates do the same thing before setting off. Their jobs seemed to mostly consist of counting and watching, and I thought Winkle and Yates would probably do well at the garden. So, is it true that people go missing here all the time? He asked it carefully, like I might get offended, and when I laughed, it seemed to put him at ease. Nah, people like to embellish. We do have people go missing, but no more than usual. He nodded, breathing out in relief. Good. I was worried I might wander off to use the bathroom and never come back again. He laughed, but I didn't share it. You should be careful if you go off by yourself. People do seem to get led astray sometimes, and people do go missing. Places like this usually have people disappear more often than usual, though. They're peaceful places, places where people put their mind at ease, and people sometimes forget that and wander off forever. Officer Winkle gave me an odd look, like he couldn't figure out if I was messing with him or not, but I was dead serious. We had promised not to take any of the officers, but the lady sometimes did things her own way, and the warden likely wouldn't hold a few staff against her. As I watched them go, it was hard not to think about the man who'd gone missing a week ago, the one whose job had been to disappear. The black bag had come off easily, leaving him standing by the gate in a state of confusion. When his cuffs had just fallen off, he rubbed his wrists and must have thought that God himself had set him free. He looked at the parking lot, clearly contemplating freedom, but that was when the call had come. It was subtle, like perfume on the wind, but he'd clearly heard it. If this had been a cartoon, he would have floated along the path like a lovesick skunk. But this was real life, and he had walked slowly and hesitantly towards the call of something much older and craftier than him. The cobbles had likely still been warm from the day's heat as he wound his way through the garden, and we had followed. There were 12 of us, the usual security detail, and the orders were simple. Don't get in the way, unless he somehow resists the pull of the lady. If so, stop him from escaping, by any means necessary. The lady wanted her meat breathing, but being lively was a luxury she did not require. If we had to toss his gasping body into the lily pond, then so be it. So far, it was working just fine, though the man in the orange jumpsuit kept looking around like he could see us. It unnerved me some, even though I knew we weren't making any noise. Hooves or not, we could have sprinted through a bed of dead leaves and made no sound. Randy was near me, and the look on his face made it clear that he liked this even less than I did. "'Tain't right," he whispered, too low for anyone but me to hear him. "How do we know this fella ain't innocent? Someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. They put him on death row, Randy. Could they do that if they weren't pretty sure?" "Why not?" Randy said, a little louder than I thought was strictly wise. "They probably do it all the time. This guy could be nothing more than a patsy, and here we are getting ready to put him to death." He turned to look in our direction then, and we both shut our mouths as he walked past the poisonous fungi display and towards something new and even less savory, a monster-sized Venus flytrap. "Yeah, what about the tourists or the locals she takes? Do they deserve it?" Well, nah, but we aren't like them anymore, Randy. You told me that. We're her children, and they are meat for her table. Whatever hang-ups you have about it, you better get over it. This stops her from taking the dads who are here with their kids, the mothers looking for a day of beauty, the old folks just going for a walk, and the sons and daughters here for a relaxing time. Randy moved off then, but he seemed to accept it. I wished I'd believed a word of the crap that I had spewed, because to me, it felt pretty wrong, too. I guessed that After a couple of 100 years, it would be easier. But for right now, it made me feel dirty, unclean, inhuman. We followed him as he approached the lily pond, and when the lights came on, he took a step back. The water of the pond swirled, the ripples flowing out like eels, and then she began to rise from the surface. The water never touched her, her clothes perfectly dry and lovely, and she was smiling as she spread her arms wide. "At last, you've come. Come, I'll take care of you." He splashed into the water, the cuffs of his jumpsuit saturating with pond water, but he never noticed. He was in her power, her thrall to play with, and when she drew him to her, he wrapped his arms around her like she was his long-lost love. Even from the outskirts of the grove, we could hear him weeping. He was crying like he had never seen anyone so beautiful, and as they sank into the water, he didn't even seem to notice. The lily pond swallowed them up, and when she emerged a few moments later, the lady looked far more resplendent than ever. We cheered. Despite what I knew had happened to that man, I cheered. I saw Randy cheering despite his misgivings earlier. We knew the sacrifice had been accepted, and good or bad, right or wrong, we knew it was for her, and thus it was good for us. No matter what it did for our collective soul, it was good because it served her. "Know what I mean?" Winkle asked, and I shook my head a little and agreed without having a clue what he was talking about. We made more small talk. We passed the night, and as midnight struck, we grouped them back up and took them back to the bus. They were muddy, they were tired, but there were still 25 of them, and that was what mattered. We waved as the buses left, knowing we would do it again Thursday, and dreading it. We knew also that the first of the month would bring in another sacrifice, and we dreaded that as well. "I'm going into town," Randy said, dropping his hands limply. "Where?" I asked him, and when he looked back, I could see the purest look of melancholy on his face. "There's a 24-hour liquor store, and I have a 10 in my boot. I'm gonna see what that'll get me, see if I can still get drunk." I watched him go, wondering if any of us had really known what service to the lady would entail. He would lead her troops into combat, he would guard her keep and train her knights, but he could not stand by and watch men who may or may not be guilty plunge into that cloudy water. As I turned and went back into the garden, I wondered how long I would be able to do it either. "Hello?" No, I haven't seen anyone leaving. Male, black hair, brown eyes, 5'9", probably in a hospital gown. I got it. I'll pass it along to Carl, thanks. Hey, what room did you say they were in? 301, of course, I got you. I hung up and rubbed the bridge of my nose. That was the third patient this year that had disappeared out of room 301. And it was only June. Well, that wasn't quite true, I reminded myself, as I dialed Carl and passed along the description. This was the 50th person who had disappeared from that room in the history of Kashmir Medical Center. That may not seem like a lot, considering how old the hospital is, but when you consider that it's from a single room, then you have to put it together that something is a little off. Room 301 on 3 North, yeah, that 3 North, has been disappearing patients for as long as anyone can remember. 3 North was the first wing on that floor, so it's the oldest and the most storied. Voices, specters, disappearances, and strange happenings are pretty common up there, and this is just another piece of the weird pie. It's a piece that draws the police in every now and again, because the people who go missing don't always come back. There are dozens of missing persons cases that start with subject was seen by a nurse in room 301 of Kashmir Medical, and the PR for the hospital is not great. I've talked to some of the nurses about it, especially my expert on Kashmir lore, Nurse Robinson. 301? Of course I've heard of it. I filed more police calls from that room than any other nurse I know. That's great, I blurted, walking it back a little as I saw the look on her face. I mean, not great, but great. You have the information and know what I'm talking about. She smirked. Relax, kid. I know what you meant. So, any idea who the first person to disappear was? No clue. I wasn't here when the place opened. Heck, I wasn't even born when the place opened. I don't think anyone kept records of it back then. Sometimes people just up and leave, you know. Not everyone who disappears around here is from nefarious or supernatural means. Some people just skip out on the bill, medicate and dash, and they probably make up more than a few of the people that have left room 301. It's the ones that couldn't have done it that get me. I remember one of the first patients to disappear on my watch was a little old man with one leg. He had a prosthetic, but I doubt very strongly that he could have left without a lot of help. Why do you think so? I asked, taking notes. The one leg he had was riddled with gangrene, and if he hadn't had it removed, he would have died in short order of blood poisoning. There was the woman on oxygen who left her tank behind, and the lady with 4 kids who never went to sleep before telling each of them good night. There have been some regular folk in there, of course, but some of the ones who go missing just don't make much sense to me. I was still thinking about it as I came downstairs, and I nearly ran into a familiar figure as he walked out of the stairwell. The red-clad orderly had become a little less secretive after the business with Carl, but I think maybe Carl and I were still the only ones who really noticed him. He smiled when he saw me, dipping his bald head and holding the door for me. Well, 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 if it isn't my young friend. Going down? Yeah, I was heading back to relieve Carl, I said, something occurring to me before I could walk fully into the stairwell. Say, you've been coming here for a long, long time, right? The orderly nodded slowly. I suppose it seems long to you. To me, it just seems like another day. Right, but what I mean is that you've been here since before the hospital. Correct. Do you know anything about 301 on the 3rd, but I never got to finish? He sucked in a breath like someone had plunged him into ice water and shuddered all over. That room is not natural. I do not go there. The souls in that room are not for me. That took me aback a little. What do you mean? Aren't all the souls within your domain? It was hard to see unless you had spent some time around him, but the orderly actually appeared paler. That room is outside my jurisdiction. Some people are not of the world that we inhabit, but are worlds controlled by others. That room is one of those rooms. So, who does it belong to? He looked at his watch and told me to walk with him. I'll try to explain it all, but I doubt it will all be conveyed. Do you remember the girl you helped pass on? Yeah, the one with the bright future. Well, there was a girl like that in that room a very long time ago. A girl who felt she had all the time in the world. She was in there for something minor, an appendix that was bothering her, but when she went to sleep one night, she discovered it was far worse than she thought. She woke up to find me waiting for her, telling her it was time to go.
She wanted to know where, and when I told her it was her time to go, she said no. We talked about it, but she just kept refusing. Eventually, I left, assuming she would move on by herself, but she did not. That room has become her Desmay, and she guards it jealously.
Her what? I asked, not recognizing the word.
Her Desmay. It's a pocket world that ghosts make sometimes. Room 301 is hers, and sometimes she takes people from it. It's not her fault. She's a very lonely little girl, and she likes to have company. She doesn't realize that the people there are being devoured, so she can continue to exist in that space. She is greedy, she is sad, and she is eternal.
He stopped outside room 317, telling me that this was where he had to leave. The code blue came overhead as I reached the stairs. It looked like the orderly had led another person to the hereafter. I told Carl about it when I went to relieve him so he could get back to work, and he nodded solemnly. I'd figured it was probably something like that. It's always some damn thing around here. You know, I get more calls about that room than anything else here. Don't suppose I can tell them it's a ghost kid, can I? I shook my head. Probably not. Sure would make it easier. They're starting to get suspicious of all the disappearances. It's normal for people to run out on their bill from time to time, but when it's the same room again and again, they start to put the pieces together and decide the hospital has something to hide. It keeps happening. It could lose us our accreditation, and that'd be real bad. He left not long after, needing to speak with the coroner and add his name to the death paperwork, and I settled in to ponder. Michael came in a little later, looking to kill a half an hour on break, and I asked him what he knew about 301. I know there's some weird calls that come from it sometimes. I asked what he meant, and he took a seat in one of my swivel chairs. Well, one night I got a call from a little girl in the middle of the night. She sounded like she might be about 9 or 10, and she was pretty bossy. She told me I needed to come to her tea party because she was missing a fourth, and none of the people there were any fun. I figured it was someone's kid playing games, and when I called the nurse's station, they assured me that there was no one in there. The room was empty at the time, and they said the door was locked because of it. She called back an hour later, asking why I wasn't at the tea party, and when I told her I was working, she hung up on me. Has she ever called back? Few times, usually to invite me to a tea party, but it's always weeks apart. Weirder than that, I got a call from a woman asking for help a few years ago. It was right after the lady with the kids went missing, Susan something or another, and she said this little girl was keeping her from leaving. I asked her how the little girl was stopping her, and she said that the little girl had made the doorway disappear, and every time she tried to escape, it would lead to nothing but a lot of running. Then I heard a little girl ask who she was talking to, and the line went dead. Weird, I said, but Michael shook his head. Nah, weird was what happened a couple of weeks ago. I was working late, and around 11:30, I got a call from the third floor. I figured it was from 309. The lady in there was having trouble getting her husband, but instead, I was treated to a low noise coming from the receiver. It was weird, like a kind of growling that rose and fell the longer I listened to it. I turned the volume up as high as it would go, and that's when I heard it. Screaming. The tortured screams of a whole bunch of people. It was like that recording of The Hole in Russia, the one they claim goes straight to hell. Except it was like they got softer and louder the longer I listened to them. Finally, I just hung up after a while, but it was hard to shake. I I hear it sometimes in my dreams, and I don't like it." He left not long after, saying he thought he might go take in the memorial garden instead, and I felt a little sorry I had asked. Despite this, I asked Gerald the same question when he came to take out the garbage in the lobby. Gerald was coming up in the world these days, working the lobby instead of changing out the rooms, and he seemed happy to be away from the third floor. He sobered a bit when I asked him, some of the smile creeping out of him, and told me that he wouldn't go into that room for anything. The third floor is very haunted, but that room is cursed. Cursed? Yes, people disappear from there all the time, and not just patients like they want you to believe. We've lost 5 members of the custodial team in the time I've been there, but they always get chalked up to job deserters or poor work ethics. I have a suspicion that might have been the room that Maria disappeared from, and it's been getting hungry lately." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine at the words. "The hospital may not notice all of them, but I have changed enough rooms to know who is skipping out and who is disappearing. It's getting more frequent, and if it's allowed to continue, then it will soon become noticeable to even the normal people who aren't surrounded by it every day." He left then, and I was left with more to ponder. So that's how I came to be outside room 301, just as the sun came up one morning, pondering whether I actually wanted to go in and investigate or not. I had taken a step towards the door when someone put a hand on my shoulder, and I turned around to find the orderly behind me.
"Not yet. Someday maybe, but not today."
"From everything I'm hearing, it's getting worse. Something has to be done," I told him, feeling that this was true.
"And one day you may do something, but not today. If you go in there now, you will never come out again. I promise you that. Grow in your power. Learn all that you can. Make some friends who can help you. And then try this one. I believe you would have an easier time with that harpy in the operating room than this one, and she is very angry. Not today. Save this one for another time."
I've been sitting on this for a little while, but I think it's time. This happened about 3 years ago. I was, without a doubt, the worst kind of hiker. You know those guys who are all leave no sign, bagging their garbage, burying their poop, cleaning up their campsite, respecting nature's natural beauty and all that? Yeah, that wasn't me. I liked camping. My parents liked camping. But there was always a mentality of the woods will take care of things. I watched my dad leave a whole cooler full of empty beer cans at the site one time when I was 8. We brought a couch with us on a camping trip one time, just because Dad knew of a ravine nearby. Broken fishing rods, left those by the creek. Garbage, right on the ground. Hell, we left a whole tent once because Dad couldn't get it back in the bag. We didn't use campgrounds either. Mom and Dad would pack up and find somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live off the land for a couple of days, then leave their crap behind. I can't say that this is why I am the way I am. I know better than to litter and be a pig, but in my head, the woods will always take care of themselves. It's been here for millions of years. Why is my trash and stuff gonna mess with it? If my styrofoam cooler kills a couple of trees, then they didn't deserve to be there, right? That's what I thought, at least. I go camping about 3 times a year. The start of spring, the start of summer, and the end of summer. I live in California, so I always just pack up my pickup, get some food and beer and recreational greenery, and head out to somewhere remote. A buddy of mine from work hadn't shut up about this overlook an hour from the city, right outside the Santa Lucia mountain range, and I figured I'd go crash out there for a weekend. Unlike my parents, I'm not a living off the land kind of person. I brought food, I brought stuff, and I intended to do nothing but sit in the wilderness, sleep in my hammock, and get buzzed. I called out Friday and found the perfect spot by lunchtime. It was gorgeous, overlooking the valley and so remote that if I were to get really hurt, I'd probably die out here with no one the wiser. I set up my hammock, set out my fire logs with some water, just in case, and just kinda spread out a bit. I made some lunch, sandwiches, rolled a joint, and just kinda got mellow for a bit as the day rolled on. It was nice out here, just watching the clouds and listening to nature. I was soon pretty well lit, and the sun started creeping down as I set to lighting my fire. There was probably a burn ban in effect, but I had water, and I didn't care. Out here, no one was going to see me anyway, and I started roasting hot dogs as the sun cut a fantastic line across the sky. That was the first time I noticed them. I remember looking up and whispering, "Shit," as I mistook them for rangers or cops or something. They were just silhouettes on the ridge, not far from my camp, 3 or 4 of them, and they had these wide, flat-topped hats, like park rangers or the guy on the oatmeal box. I watched them for a minute, thinking I was busted, but they just stood there. They didn't move, they didn't call out, but I know they saw me. My fire had to be visible for a ways at this height, and the longer they stayed there, the more creeped out I felt. Why were they just standing there? If they wanted me to leave, then why not tell me to leave? I didn't know, but once the sun set, I noticed they had vanished and just kept an eye peeled. I had my gun, a big old .45, so I wasn't worried, but I suddenly wished I had a tent to sleep in instead of just a hammock. I sparked up again after eating a pack of dogs, though, and that took some of the edge off. Took any thought of the shadow guys out of my mind whatsoever. I dozed off in my hammock, but I dreamed about them that night, too. I dreamed that they were in my campsite, just standing around and watching me. They were like the outlines of people, like when someone stands in front of the sun and all you get is a burnt out image of them. They didn't have any features, no eyes or anything, and I was frozen there as they looked at me. They didn't say anything, they just watched me, and it felt like being sleep paralyzed the whole time. I woke up after dawn, almost fell out of my hammock, and started making breakfast as I stirred up the ashes of last night's fire. I wondered if it had really been a dream or not, but I felt like it must have been. Why would they come out here not to say anything? All my stuff was there too, down to the hot dog wrappers I'd left on the ground next to the fire. I tossed it in absent-mindedly and ate eggs and ham. The ice was still holding out. It was spring and not too hot yet, so I decided to go for a forest pub crawl today. Translation, I put a bunch of beer into my backpack and walked out into the woods so I could have a drunk hike. I spent about 5 hours hiking in the woods, tossing my dead soldiers into the trees as I finished them. Some of them broke, most of them didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I hiked in the woods. I never saw anything. Wasn't like I spotted someone hiding behind a tree, but it was like deep pockets of shadows that shouldn't have been there. It was midday, the sun was high, and I should have had major visibility. Even so, I found myself looking around as the crawling feeling just got worse and worse. Some of it was being drunk in the hot woods with no water, and when I found a stream, I plunged my face into it to get some clarity. I drank a little. Dad always said running water was fine to drink from, and when something snapped not far behind me, I looked up like a zebra at a watering hole. I looked around, trying to find what was stalking me, but there was nothing, just the quiet forest and the gently rushing stream. No, I didn't believe that. I'd felt like I was stalked all day, and as I watched the trees, I felt sure that something moved out there. I got up and started running, the zebra analogy too hard to break, and I kept waiting for the claws to sink into me, the teeth to bite, the hot breath to fall on my neck. It was gonna come at any minute. I could feel it. And when I tripped over a fallen log, I just lay there and waited for the end. It would get me now. It would get me, and I'd be dead. I'd be dead. Nothing happened. I lay there for about 10 minutes just knowing that it would get me when I moved, but it never came. When the ants started to bite my legs, I sat up and swiped at them. I'd fallen next to an anthill, and I had accidentally stomped on it in my haste, and they were mad as hell about it. I ended up going back to the creek to wash them off, a haphazard trip that took me another 10 minutes, and I was still looking around like a scared animal. I sat with my legs in the creek until they had stopped throbbing, and then made my miserable way back to camp. It was not as much fun walking back as it had been walking out, and I was jittery and tense the whole way. The sun was starting to slip down, and I absolutely didn't want to be out here when it got dark. Too many things could be crunching around out here in the dark. I made it back to camp before it got dark, and as I cooked my dinner, the sun started to ride low again. It was more hot dogs tonight, cooked over the fire, but I couldn't finish all of them. I was too scared to look away from the ridge, and I ended up burning more than one of them. They tasted fine either way, but I had eyes only for the shadows on the ridge. They had the same wide-brimmed hats. A few of them had canes, but none of them were really people. They were like shadows, the images burned at Hiroshima, the photo negatives that sometimes get burned into old photographs. All of them at once, and none of them at all. They just stood there, watching me. They didn't move, they didn't stir, and as the sun sank, I became colder and colder. I should have gone to my truck and left, but I didn't. I made myself put it out of my mind. I convinced myself that I was just being foolish. When it got dark, I got in my hammock and tried to get comfortable, but it wouldn't come. My leg hurt. I was sunburnt. I was hungover. I was dehydrated. I was, but ultimately, I was afraid. I was afraid that when I closed my eyes, they would get me. I was afraid they would just carry me off into the night and I'd never be seen again. They would find my truck and my campsite, but never me. Maybe, I thought as I finally nodded off, someone would look up one afternoon at sunset and see me on that ridge too, just watching. I must have fallen asleep, and I like to think I dreamed what came next. I want to, but I can't convince myself that I did. I woke up and saw them standing around me. I could see them, and not just the ones in front of the fire. They were darker than the night itself somehow, and they began to creep closer to me. Crept is the wrong word, though. They slid along the ground like ghosts in some of the horror movies I'd watched as a kid. They hemmed me in, my body shaking, but my voice stuck in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare speak, and as they knelt around me, I heard whispering. It was a terrible sound, and it follows me into sleep sometimes. You come here to the womb of creation and leave your waste. You are a brainless creature, fit only to destroy things made by your betters. You burn the wood of a creature who has existed before you were more than a twinkling in your father's eye. You destroy a place that was new when this planet cooled. You throw your trash into a home shared by 100 billion organisms, and you claim to be superior here. The better. You are nothing. You will die and be forgotten. On and on and on. They whispered endlessly to me, telling me how worthless I was, how I was a nuisance and a nothing, and how I would never change. Then, one of them rose up above my hammock, his body seeming to hang over me, like a shadow cast from above. He looked like them, but he was clearly their boss or something, and when he brought the cane down on nothing but air, I heard it crack like a thunderbolt. Go back to your stinking pit, but be warned. The next time you come to our woods, and ruin our place. You will not be allowed to scamper off so easily. You are a stunted thing who was taught badly, but ignorance is forgivable. If you persist in this folly, we will not be so kind again. Now go, it yelled, and I opened my eyes to find that it was morning. I was laying in my hammock, piss dribbling down my leg, and I knew that I better not be here when the sun came up. I cleaned up everything. I picked up all my garbage. I cleaned up my site. I poured water over the fire and mixed it with dirt like they had always said to on TV. Then I took everything with me, and I ran for the truck. That was Sunday, and I've been kind of afraid to leave my apartment. What if they're waiting out there for me? What if they find me slipping, or they don't like that I don't recycle or something like that? What if I offend them and they drag me back to the woods to be punished? That's part of why I'm writing this. If you're like me, someone who doesn't care about their mess or just leaves the woods wrecked, then watch out. Don't let the Dark Watchers catch you messing up their forest, because they do more than just watch. Don't let them see you slipping, or you might find out what sort of punishment awaits those who anger them. I was looking for something to make my end of summer sleepover amazing. What I got was a sleepover that no one would ever forget. Margot, Jenny, and I had been friends for years, since kindergarten even, and we were getting ready to start 7th grade in a few days and wanted to hold our annual slumber party. I had the pigs in a blanket, the chips that Margot liked, the sour gummy worms for Jenny, and a huge bottle of Dr. Fizz for us to share. I was getting the movies ready when I realized I hadn't found our favorite game yet, and started hunting through the closet. We had played Mall Madness, a game my mom had given me from when she was young, and it was a hit at any sleepover. We would shop till we drop, charge it up, and then laugh about who had the best deals and spent the least amount of money. It was great. I had probably replaced the batteries in it a dozen or more times, but I just couldn't find it anywhere. I had always put it at the top of my closet, right beside my old Barbie travel case, but today it was nowhere to be found. I blew out in exasperation, wondering where it could be, but ultimately decided to go check the attic. The game had come from the attic after all, so maybe Mom had put it back up there. I pulled down the ladder, glad it was still daylight so it didn't look so spooky up there, and went to go look for Mall Madness. It was kind of a chore because Mom is something of a hoarder. Dad calls her a pack rat, and it seems pretty fitting. She keeps everything. She had clothes from when my sister and I were little. She's got art projects from when she was in school up there. And she had boxes and boxes of old photos and memory books, all kinds of things. I pushed aside a bunch of dresses and found an area dominated by old toys and games that she had saved. It was a mishmash of dolls and books and some old doll houses and a couple of dusty board games. I didn't find Mall Madness, but I found about 7 others. Apples to Apples was for babies, and Uncle Wiggily looked kind of weird. Don't Wake Daddy was missing pieces, some of which I'd lost, and Monopoly was just too long. I was about to give up when I saw a black box at the bottom of the stack that I didn't think I'd ever seen before. It was covered in dust, the letters barely visible, and I pulled it down, tugging it quickly so the other boxes wouldn't fall. I wiped off the cover and read the red lettering on it slowly, the red and black hard to read since it was so faded. Mystery Man, the name proclaimed, and I was about to open it and see the instructions when my mom called and let me know that my friends were here, so I ran downstairs to see them. I tossed the game onto my bed as I ran past, figuring we would check it out later, and we were soon all laughing and jumping as we got excited about the night. We ate dinner, we played hide and seek in the backyard, We hung out in my treehouse, and as it started to get dark, we came in to watch movies, play games, and start the rest of the evening's activities. Dad works nights, and Mom didn't really ever make us go to bed when we were having a sleepover. We usually passed out sometime around midnight, but tonight, we wanted to stay up till we heard my dad pull in from work. We wanted to see if we could stay up till dawn, just to see if we could, and we had enough snacks and sugar to manage it, we thought. By 11:30, we had watched 2 movies, eaten most of the snacks, and drank half a bottle of soda, as we braided each other's hair during the end part of Balto. We were a little bored with movies, and Jenny asked if we could play Mall Madness for a little bit. That was when I remembered the game, and told them I had something different in mind tonight. The game had worked its way half under my pillow somehow, and when I pulled it out, my friends oohed and awed at it appreciatively. We opened the box and found a black board with silver spaces, the big orange phone in the middle having an honest-to-God spin dial on it. We had cards with descriptions on them, and it felt more like we were assembling a police sketch than a dream date. We would go around the board, landing on spaces and drawing cards, and when someone found a card with a number on it, we would dial the number, and it would help us determine the identity of our mystery man. "So it's a little like Dream Date then," Margot said. "Seems weird," Jenny said, "like we're hunting him or something." I looked at the instructions, but they gave no particular instruction on the purpose for making a description of the guy. We would take turns until we had assembled our mystery man, and then we would call 000 on the phone and give our description to the person on the other end. Somehow, they would know if it was right or not, and tell us that we had won, or tell us to try again. "Simple enough," I said, and I picked up the dice and rolled first. It was about 4 turns later when Jenny landed on a card that gave her a phone call. She dialed the number, but she was having some trouble until I showed her how the rotary phone worked. Mom had showed me, saying that was how they used to call people 1,000,000 years ago, and once she got the number plugged in, she held the phone against her head and waited for the click. Someone came on after 3 rings, a weird staticky voice that I didn't much like, and whatever it told Jenny, she didn't seem to like it either. After a few minutes, she put the phone down, her hands shaking a little. "Well, what did it say?" Margot asked. Jenny cleared her throat, trying again to get control. I'm not supposed to tell anyone. The phone man said the call was just for me." She handed me the dice, her hands very sweaty and a little shaky, and we continued. It was my turn to use the phone next, but Margot pulled out a card and laid it down. The card let her steal my phone call, and I laughed a little as I stuck my tongue out at her. She dialed the number and held the phone, interested to hear what was to come. None of us thought it was real. Well, Margot and I didn't, but Jenny scooted a little away as she made her call. The voice picked up, and something quick and harsh made Margot's smile slip off her face as she listened. Her lips trembled as she put the phone down, and she wrote something on a piece of paper and shook her head when I tried to pass her the dice. The guy on the phone said to let you roll again. He said some other stuff, but I'm not supposed to say. I rolled again and grumbled as I landed just shy of a phone space. I wanted to hear what had them so spooked. This was a board game, ages 10 and up and all that, and there was no way it could be that terrifying. We continued taking turns, the girls wanting to keep playing, despite their obvious discomfort. Finally, I got my wish. I drew a card after landing on a spot, and it was a phone booth. Searched the deck for a phone card and dialed the number. I took the first one I found and dialed the number, letting it ring 5 times before someone picked up.
"Mystery man is blonde, about 6 feet tall, and a wide-brimmed hat. That's for your ears only, Toots. So don't tell any of those other little bitches what I said. I'll know."
That was a little weird, and I put the phone down with some hesitation. I didn't think they could say things like that in a board game like this. Margot and Jenny didn't bother to ask what he'd said, and I made notes as Margot took her turn. I had a blonde card and a wide-brimmed hat card, but I didn't have one that said 6 feet tall. I guessed I'd have to draw for it. Meanwhile, Margot had gotten another phone call, and as she listened, I saw her glance over at Jenny, and the look wasn't friendly. I didn't know what the phone guy was telling her, but it seemed to be making her mad. We played the game for hours, and in that time, the game got worse and worse. Anytime Jenny got a phone call, it nearly put her into tears. Anytime Margot got a phone call, it seemed to make her angrier and angrier. I tried to take the phone from Jenny at one point, offering to take the call for her, but she shook her head and told me the phone man had said that she had to take it, whether she liked it or not. "Yeah," Margot said, her eyes looking mean. "She needs to take her calls, just like the rest of us." As the game went on, we got more clues. I learned that my mystery man was a 6-foot-tall blonde in a wide-brimmed hat with a mustache, black pants, and a white shirt. I had most of that, but I was still missing the 6 feet tall with a mustache card. The man on the phone had alluded to the fact that Margot would soon make her move against Jenny, the two being like dogs ready to fight. And when Margot threw down a card, it looked more like a knife toss than a friendly showing. "White glove. I get to take one of your cards, Jenny." Jenny nodded, holding her cards out like a fan, and Margot picked the fourth one, pulling it back smugly before glowering at it. "You switched it," she accused, flipping it around to show Jenny a green sweater card. Jenny shook her head. "Nuh-uh." "Yes, you did," Margot accused. "The phone man said you were a cheater, but I didn't want to believe it at first. Looks like he was right." I never cheated," Jenny said, almost crying. "Then why wasn't this a green scarf card? The phone guy..." But she brought her teeth together hard, and it sounded like wood clacking together. "What?" I asked. "What did he say?" "Nothing," Margot said. "Doesn't matter. Just play the game." Jenny didn't look like she wanted to keep playing the game, but she didn't look like she was capable of stopping either. The game would continue, whether we wanted it to or not. And after that, the phone calls got even weirder. I pulled a card, dialed a number, and was greeted with about 10 seconds of heavy breathing before he spoke.
The mystery man has a long, sharp knife. He's walking down the street. Turn left on Martin Drive. I'll soon be there.
That sent chills through me. Martin Drive was 2 streets away. That was like an easy 20-minute walk. What the heck was this? These weren't pre-recordings. This had to be live, but that was impossible. The game was probably 20 years old at least. It couldn't happen. "Look," I said, hanging up the phone, let's just call it a draw. I think this is getting a little too real." And the orange phone rang, and I felt my words wither in my mouth as we just sat there and looked at it. It was like watching a bomb tick down, none of us wanting to be the one to touch it. It just kept ringing and ringing, and finally, to my surprise, Jenny reached out to pick it up. Her hands shook, her breath coming in quick gasps. She lifted it to her ear, and I heard someone snarl something as she winced like she'd been struck. She held the phone out for me, hands moving like someone with nerve damage, and said it was for me. I took it and held it to my ear and said hello.
"Whether you play the game or not, you little bitch, the mystery man is still coming. If none of you wins, then he's coming to get all of you. But if one of you manages to win, then they might be safe. You never know. Better finish what you started.
I hung up the phone, trying to keep my teeth from chattering as I told them what he'd said. "That's not true," Margot said. "The phone guy told me that I had to beat Jenny or I'd get taken. He said Jenny was trying to win on purpose so the mystery man would get me." Jenny burst into tears. "He said that you two were trying to sacrifice me to the mystery man and that I deserved it. He said I was useless, just holding you two back, and I deserved to get dragged away." I thought about it, weighing what he had said. Sounds like if we all win, then he can't get at any of us. We have to work together to get out of this. Jenny shook her head. "He said if I told you what my mystery man looked like, that he'd get me for sure." "Me too," Margot said, the anger slowly turning into fear. "Well, who cares what he said? He's coming regardless, so we have to do something." So we played the game cooperatively. Helping each other proved a better strategy, and Margot soon had everything for her mystery man. Margot dialed 000 and declared that her mystery man was 5'4" and bald, with a hockey mask and a machete and a white jumpsuit. The voice came from the rotary, making us all jump with its suddenness as it reverberated around the room.
"You have discovered your mystery man, Margot. You are safe for now."
We were still for a moment. Then Jenny reluctantly picked up the dice and kept playing. She got a card, dialed the number, and choked out a sob as the man on the phone told her about her mystery man. "He's on your street," she said, sobbing a little, and I rolled the dice so we could get to her turn again. "White glove," I said. "Let me see him." Jenny held up her cards, but she started nodding at one that was 5 into the stack. I drew it, and sure enough, it was the mustache. Now all I needed was the 6 foot tall and the knife. Jenny went again, drew a card, and breathed a sigh of relief as she dialed 000. "My mystery man is 6 feet tall, dark-haired, with a rope and a long coat." The phone made the sound again before declaring,
"Jenny, you have discovered your mystery man. You are safe for now."
I picked up the dice when I heard something creak the door downstairs. It was long and loud, like a funhouse door at the carnival. I tossed the dice, moved my piece, and drew a card. It was a phone call, and I threw it away and rolled again. I moved, drew, and pumped my fist as I got the 6 foot card. I was rolling again when the phone began to ring. I let it ring, rolling and moving like a madman. I drew, but it wasn't what I needed. I got another phone card and threw it away. I could hear my mystery man on the stairs, moving as slow as any horror movie villain. I drew the gun and cursed as I tossed it away. I drew another white glove card, but I tossed it and kept rolling and moving. I could hear him on the stairs, his boots clumping menacingly. I had to find the knife. I had to banish the mystery man. If I didn't, it would mean my death. He came onto the landing when the ringing phone became too much, and I picked it up and put it down again. It started to ring after a few seconds, and I did it again before moving my piece. I could still hear his boots in the hallway that led to my room, and they grew louder by the second. Jenny and Margot were watching the door to my bedroom like it might explode, but I was focused on the task. Rope, toss. A wide-brimmed hat, toss. He was walking past my little sister's room now. He'd pass Mom and Dad's room after that, and then it would be down to my room at the end of the hall. What would happen if he got to me? Would they even believe Margot and Jenny? Would the mystery man leave them alone once he'd got me? I didn't know, but my heart leapt into my throat. I'd drawn the knife. I was done. I dialed 000 as soon as the door opened to my room. Jenny and Margot gasped, sliding away from the board and as far from the door as they could get. My mystery man has blonde hair, a wide-brimmed hat, is 6 feet tall, has black pants, a white shirt, and a knife. I practically screamed it into the phone, falling forward to cover it as I expected that long, sharp knife to stab into me at any minute. I heard the tone, and then heard the phone crackle again.
That was a close one, Heather. You're safe from your mystery man. For now.
I just lay there for a while, panting and trembling, as Margot and Jenny came to comfort me. They told me they had seen him standing in the doorway, his blonde hair spilling beneath his hat, and a sharp knife in his hand. He had raised it, took a single step, and then just disappeared into nothingness. We lay there, just kind of basking in the feeling of being alive, until I heard my dad pulling into the driveway. We had made it. We stayed up until sunrise, just like we wanted to. I went down and hugged my dad, who seemed surprised that I was still awake, but glad to see me, and then the three of us turned in. I put Mystery Man back in the attic, and have never touched it again. One brush with death was enough for me. So if you find a copy of your own while trolling through the thrift stores and antique malls in your area, be very careful with it. The mystery man you find might not be a mystery for very long. I knew he was going to be trouble from the first time he stepped on the quad. Stragview had just gotten over COVID, the plague the world was still wary about, and inmates were on high alert. Something most people don't understand is that when your population is limited to about 1,000 guys in the same pool of disease, your immune system isn't as durable as it once was. A cold or the flu can sometimes put down a whole dorm like it never would on the street. And if they get it, then they know it only came from 2 places. You can't get something from the bubble once you're in the bubble. So sickness either comes from the guards or new inmates, and they know it. A pod can usually tell who's sick and with what quicker than we can, and sometimes they'll quarantine an inmate or push them out before they can get everyone else sick. It actually happened not long ago, and it started a riot that killed 3 COs, 30 inmates, and sent a lot from both camps to the infirmary with injuries. It had all started because of lockdown and sick inmates, and no one wanted to see it happen again. So, when they brought in inmate Clarion, I sighed audibly. God damn it, I cursed, and Jackson looked up to see what had caught my eye. What, it's just a new guy. Is he starting trouble already? He is trouble, I said, watching the other inmates as they marked him. Officer Gerber pushed him into the quad, H3 to be exact, and he stumbled out there with his mat and his bedroll and a look that made me think of lost puppies. He was pale, very pale, and his eyes looked sunken as if he hadn't been sleeping well. He was scrawny, almost emaciated, and I didn't like the way he winced and rubbed his belly. His stomach was the biggest part of him, and it protruded against the front of his uniform shirt like a balloon. It looked like the stomach of a much larger man, but it wasn't until I'd been watching him for a while that I finally put my finger on it. His stomach reminded me of a pregnant woman's stomach. Johnson looked past me, focusing on the new guy as he tried to find his cell, and finally just shrugged. Looks fine to me, you're just paranoid, he said, as he went back to his paperwork. I wish I had been. The next day, I was approached by inmate Pelachek, the houseman for the quad, telling me he needed to change cells. I looked at my roster and realized he was inmate Clarion's new roommate, and felt the same creeping dread I had the day before. Why? You've been in that cell for as long as I can remember. It's him or me, and I know how this works. If you'll move me, he can just have the cell. Why? Did he snore or something? Appalachia shuddered like someone had dumped cold water on him. If that were all it was, it would be fine. No, the man is not right. He talks to himself at night. Talks like he's talking to a baby. I woke up this morning after finally going to sleep, and he was sitting on the toilet and rubbing his stomach as he talked. He shut up when he noticed me seeing him, but I will not share a room with him. The man is crazy, and my mother always told me that crazy is catching. I gave Appalachia a skeptical look. No mean feat when the man is 6'2", but I could see he wasn't joking. Appalachia is a long-term resident, an ex-Russian national who's in prison for 30 years for beating a man to death in a bar fight. His claim of self-defense was enough to save him from a life sentence, but not enough to convince the jury that caving in the man's skull had been self-defense. The guy was huge. I'd seen him trading his carbs for boiled eggs most every morning before eating a dozen or so of them and working out most of the day. If this guy was freaked out, then Clarion must be pretty weird. The only cell I got's with Mueller, and you know he snores like a buzzsaw. Better the buzzsaw than that, Appalachia said, thanking me before leaving to pack his things. 30 minutes later, he was moving the last of his stuff into Mueller's cell, trading his bottom bunk for a top bunk with a loud snore. I started watching Clarion after that, trying to figure out what had spooked Appalachia so bad, and I noticed other inmates giving him a wide berth. He ate alone, choosing to sit at a table they seemed to have designated for him. He kept to his cell mostly, seeming to prefer solitude. He received no mail, no phone calls, and he only went out to rec when he was forced to. He didn't seem to like the sun much, and slept during the day unless asked to get up. His stomach neither grew or shrank, his skin remained pale, and the bruises stayed around his eyes. I looked him up, something I didn't do often, and found out he was here for murder. He had apparently murdered his sister, but the circumstances were pretty murky. Clarion had been something of a hermit, living in the woods in a little shack, and only coming into town when absolutely necessary. He had been doing this for decades, but when he hadn't been seen in town for a week, his sister had ventured to his cabin to check on him. When she hadn't come back, the police had gone to check on them both and found something pretty grisly. The body of Sara Clarion had been found under the cabin. She'd been drained of all her fluids, all the nutrients in her body, and the coroner had said that it looked like someone had sucked her dry like a juice box. Stephen Clarion, her brother, was the only person on the property, and he had admitted to moving the body, but not to the murder. Police felt sure it was him somehow, and he'd been charged thusly. Now he was Stragview's problem, one of many, and the police in Hiawassee got to pretend that they had actually done something. Regardless, I still had to take care of the man, and I would. I soon discovered what Appalachia had meant when he said Clarion had been talking to himself. He didn't keep a roommate longer than a week the whole time I knew him, and that was only about a month. They all said the same thing. He was strange. He stared at them. He talked to himself. He sang to himself, but it all shook out to the fact that they thought he was crazy. So, one night, as I was doing a round, I came to his cell, and sure enough, Clarion was singing to himself. He had been there about a week and a half at this point, and I hadn't seen him do much more than sleep or stare off into space. Jackson said he had caught some singing, but he had mostly ignored it. Not much got to Jackson. He was old hat at this, but I was still a little curious about the mysteries this place sometimes held. So I got closer to his cell, and I recognized what he was singing. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Daddy's gonna buy you a mockingbird. I turned my flashlight off and crept up, listening as he sang to himself. And if that mockingbird don't sing, Daddy's gonna buy you a diamond ring. I leaned around to the little window on the cell, trying to get a peek at him, and saw him sitting on the toilet, rubbing his stomach. And if that diamond ring turns brass, Daddy's gonna buy you a looking glass. He was rubbing something on his stomach, lotion or oil, and crooning to it. The light coming from the overhead in there was dim, little more than a nightlight, but I watched him, mesmerized as he stroked his stomach and sang, "And if that looking glass gets broke, Daddy's gonna buy you a billy goat." As he touched his stomach, I could see something move beneath his hand. It was like ropes beneath his skin, like eels in a pot, and it seemed to touch his hand almost lovingly. With his shirt off, I could see how thin his chest was compared to the rest of him. It was sunken in, the bones jutting against his skin, but the stomach beneath it was still swollen and distended. "And if that billy goat won't pull, Daddy's gonna..." I must have made a noise or leaned against the door too hard, because he suddenly looked up, and I pushed myself out of the window and leaned against the door as I prayed he wouldn't come looking. What I'd seen had been terrifying, but the thought of him seeing me was even worse. I didn't know what he had within him, but it was bad enough that I didn't want him to know that I had seen it. The next night, we came in to find him in a corner of the day room. It seemed he had decided to come out of his shell. "See," Jackson said, "he's settling in. I knew all it would take was a little time." He came out of his shell, but it might have been better if he hadn't. For the next 3 weeks, more than one inmate began to complain about being sick. A ton of sick calls suddenly went in, and medical was swamped with complaints of people being sluggish, having no energy, and generally feeling bad. A nurse told me it appeared they had anemia, and a lot of them had low iron counts. I didn't know much about that, but I knew that the pale skin and the black circles under their eyes looked very familiar. I wasn't the only one who noticed either. Bryce, another long-term resident of H-Dorm, started spreading it around that Clarion had something catching. The sick people looked like he did, and that couldn't be a coincidence. They had to do something about it. They had to stop it from happening, and it had something to do with inmate Clarion. I was pretty sure they were right, too. I'd seen Clarion go in and out of cells all week, leaving before too much stir could be made, and the inmate would always go to the infirmary the next day. Unfortunately, Bryce did not handle it the way he should have. He attacked Clarion in the quad, in full view of the officer station, while both of us were in the bubble. I had seen Bryce and about 6 others shooting dark looks at Clarion as he stood in the corner by the kiosk. I was sort of new, but not new enough that I couldn't recognize something about to go south real hard. Jackson shook his head, claiming I was just looking for trouble, but I didn't think so. Jackson finally got tired of me just watching them and tossed me some paperwork, telling me I could do a little work if I meant to just sit around. I looked up after hearing someone yell and saw them backing Clarion towards the door as he put his hands up defensively. I cursed, seeing the knife in Bryce's hand, and told Jackson to call a code blue. Jackson grabbed his radio as I went running, and I'd come into the hallway between the quads as I heard Clarion begging for his life. I was fumbling keys, trying to find the right one, when I heard him say something that chilled me to the bone. "Don't do it. I can't be held responsible for what happens if you do." "Bullshit," Bryce said. "You ain't gonna do nothing." "Please, I'm begging you, don't..." But he grunted, and I figured Clarion had been stabbed. I had the key in the lock when a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see something long and white and slithering as it rose above the assembled men. They began to run, but not fast enough. The thing was rising out of a hole in Clarion, a jagged knife wound in his stomach. It looked like a worm, or a tentacle maybe, and it was thicker than it had any right to be. I thought it was one big something, but when it separated, I could see that it was actually many slithering white things. They shot out and caught the men, wrapping around them as they tore them to pieces. Blood hit the floor, followed by parts of people, and as they were torn up, other writhing things began to fall on the blood and suck it off the ground. It was mesmerizing, the way it cleaned them up, and I saw how it drained the parts of fluid as well. Just like it had done to his sister, said a whispery little voice in the back of my head. The team came in to find me on the floor, the key still in my hand, with nothing but withered inmate parts lying around the place, and a terrified Clarion huddled against the door as he covered his face. I explained in a shaky voice what I had seen, but medical found no wounds on Clarion at all. Other inmates were questioned, but most of them claimed they hadn't seen anything, the typical Stragview line. Inmates wouldn't have admitted to seeing a UFO most of the time, and if there was camera footage, I never saw it. The mess was cleaned up, the bodies were disposed of, families were notified, and life went on. I was given a few days to recuperate, and when I came back, Clarion was no longer my problem. He wasn't any dorm's problem, and had seemingly disappeared from Stragview altogether. I never learned what happened to him, but I think about him sometimes, and wonder what became of him. I also wonder about whatever it was that came out of him to protect him. The way it drank all that blood from its attackers, it has to be taking a toll on him as well. I wonder how long it'll be before Clarion is no more, and it's forced to find a new host to befriend.
Attention, teachers and pupils. Recess is cancelled today due to crows. That is all.
There was a collective awe from the students, but that wasn't what had caught my attention. Had the principal just said crows? Like the birds? I asked myself, as I told my third graders we would play Heads Up 7-Up. As they got set up to play, I picked up the phone and called a friend of mine in the other class. Cail had been helping me integrate into the flow of Jefferson Moore Elementary since I'd arrived here at the start of last year, and I could hear the smile on her face as she answered the phone. "Mrs. Swearington's class." "Crows?" I asked, without preamble. "Did I hear that right?" "You did. The school has a code for crows, and you should definitely follow it." I was quiet for a moment, trying to find a good response to that, until she said my name like she might have lost me. "I mean, are crows different in Ohio? 'Cause we had crows in Maine, too, but we didn't close down the playground for them." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of a very heated argument going on over what I assumed was her own game of Heads Up 7-Up. Great minds think alike, it seems. Crows here are a little different. I can't really talk about it right now. Meet me after school for drinks and I'll fill you in. Don't worry though, crow days only usually last a couple of days." "A couple of days," I said in disbelief, but that's when someone started crying and Kayla said she had to go. She hung up and I was left with more questions than answers. Wasn't that much of an inconvenience, I suppose. My kids, despite being 8 and 9, were pretty well behaved. I had very few fights, very little beyond the usual drama that surrounded little kids, and most of them were good friends who helped each other. My own game of Heads Up 7-Up was full of more laughter than arguments. And as recess ended, we started math and worked our way towards lunch. Good kids or not, it was still going to be a long day without recess. Even the well-behaved kids get stir-crazy when they can't blow off some steam on the playground. Luckily, we had gym today, so they could get their zoomies out in the fully enclosed gym building instead. We walked across the school, me leading the line as we headed for the gymnasium, and I couldn't help but glance at the playground as we walked past. Even as an adult, I thought the new playground looked pretty cool. They had replaced all the old metal equipment with colorful plastic, and it made me wish that I could take my tie and my sensible shoes off and just go play with them for a while. There were 5 huge colorful structures, teeter-totters, slides, and plenty of foursquare courts, some of those spring animals, a big sandbox and a basketball court, and a lot of shady places to sit and visit with your friends. It was an amazingly inviting place, but today it looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. The crows had taken over every inch of the playground, and they lay thick upon the land. They watched us as we passed, looking affronted to see people so close. I understood now. It was a little intimidating to see so many crows assembled. They called a group of crows a murder, and the name made sense now. They looked capable of anything as they sat there glaring at us. They looked capable of hurting even me in such numbers, and I turned my back on them with a real effort. They were still there when the bell rang to release the students for the day, and I noticed that no one went anywhere near the playground as they headed for home or the bus. Kayla shot me a text as I walked to my car and let me know that she'd have to go home with stomach problems, but that she would meet me very soon to let me know the story behind the crows. Just don't do anything dumb in the meantime. I don't want you getting in over your head. I rolled my eyes at her text, but decided I would toe the line until I had more information. I had to admit that something about that group of crows had spooked me, and I suddenly didn't like the idea of just going out there and scaring them off. I don't know how they would react, and I wasn't in a big hurry to find out. I had joked that we had crows where I was from, but I didn't think I'd ever seen crows like this. I must have been thinking about them as I lay down to sleep, because I dreamed about them that night. I was walking into the playground, the crows sitting around me and staring in disapproval. Everything beyond the playground was like mist. I was standing in a fog bank, and the deeper I went into the playground, the more crows there seemed to be. In the center of the playground was a merry-go-round, the old metal one that often injured the children who went to play on it. Standing in the center was a man, slowly rotating with the motion of the thing. He had his back to me, and I saw that he wore a coal-black suit with a high, dark mantle. His top hat was lined with feathers and shining trinkets. His boots were black and thick. He was rotating slowly, the old engine of destruction squealing as it turned ever so slowly. The crows were looking at him, their beady eyes drawn to him, and as he spun, I became afraid. I didn't think I wanted this man to look at me. I thought that if he looked at me, something terrible might happen, but I was powerless to look away. He just spun like a ballerina in a music box, and as he came around, I saw one glittering eye before I woke up in a cold sweat. There was another warning about the crows during the morning announcements, but it was hardly needed. We had all seen them as they perched on the playground equipment when we came to school that day. I was working the pickup line that morning, and the reaction of the kids weren't what drew my attention. The children were disappointed, but understanding. No, it was the reaction of the adults that caught my eye. There were some transplants, like me, who looked at it like an oddity, but it was the locals that really caught my eye. They looked at the playground like a source of childhood trauma, and many of them made sure to tell their kids not to go to the playground under any circumstances. "Keep a close eye on her," one mother said as her kindergartner walked inside, her pink coat making her stand out amongst the sea of children. "I'd hoped they wouldn't come back this year. Damn him," she whispered, and then looked at me like she had said too much before driving off in a controlled hurry. We settled in for the day's lesson, but you could tell that the mood was muted. They didn't have gym to look forward to today. The extracurricular was music, and they knew that there would be no real outside activity today. I hated it for them, and when I called Kayla at about 10:30, my text going unseen, I was in for another surprise. The woman who answered said that Miss Swearington was out today, and might be for the rest of the week. Poor dear, she caught that bug that's going around. I hope she didn't leave it behind when she was here yesterday. I hear it's nasty. I didn't even have lunch with my friend to look forward to, it seemed, and I settled in for a long day. As the class played hide-and-seek during indoor recess, I noticed that one of the students was still at her desk. Lisa was coloring up a storm, really putting swirls on her page, and I came up to check what she was drawing. She looked absolutely focused on what she was doing, showing no interest in the other students or their games. It was odd to see that kind of focus in a kid her age, and she jumped a little when I came up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder. "Whatcha?" I started, but when I looked at the page, it took my breath away. She had drawn the playground for my dream perfectly, complete with the man in the dark cloak and the top hat. He was standing on the merry-go-round, arms extended to the sky, and the crows were flying all around him. The picture was way too detailed for someone her age, much too good for someone not even in middle school, and when she looked back at me, she asked if I had seen him. "Who?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "The Crow Count," she said, matter-of-factly, as if it was something that everyone knew. "I haven't," I lied, picking up the picture and getting a better look. "Who is he?" "Mommy says not to talk about him," Lisa said, looking guilty as she realized she shouldn't be drawing him either. "I won't tell," I said as I put the page back on her desk. "Is he a friend of yours?" "No," Lisa said, and she sounded afraid of the idea that someone might think he was friends with her. "The Crow Count isn't anyone's friend. He brings the crows here. At least, that's what Mommy told me. She said I must never go into big groups of crows, or the Crow Count will take me away with the murderer." Hearing someone so young say these things made me cold all over again, but I just patted her arm and said that was very interesting. It was the most normal thing in the world to her, apparently, and I didn't want to draw attention to the fact that this was my first time hearing about it. I left her to her coloring, telling my students they had about 5 minutes left on indoor recess before we had to go back to our desks. I googled crow count and crows in Ohio, but I didn't get much. Crows in Ohio brought up some memes, because of course it did, but the crow count brought up only a single entry. It was an old Germanic legend about a ruler of crows who sometimes took children to feed his flock or young girls to be his bride. Neither were ever seen again, but it was an excuse for telling children to avoid large groups of crows, something associated with battlefields and death. The depiction, something taken from an old storybook, was very familiar. A courtly fellow in a tall hat with feathers and a dark cloak. I clicked off of it, feeling my stomach tie itself in a knot, and began geography. I was still thinking about it at the end of the day as the bell rang and everyone headed for home. The playground was still full of crows, and it was hard not to imagine that I could see someone on the playground amongst them. Could that be the hatted gentleman? The Crow Count? I didn't dare look too long, but I was beginning to get a little tired of this. 2 days with no outdoor recess was beginning to take a toll on the students. I didn't know what we'd do if this went on much longer, but it appeared we'd never find out. After a night spent dreaming about crows and the man in the tall hat, I arrived at school to find a group of adults standing around the outskirts of the playground. The crows were giving them an unhappy look, looking like bouncers preparing to kick them out, and I approached the group to see what was going on. The teachers looked at me guiltily, not seeming to be sure what to say, until Mr. Simonson, the 5th grade English teacher, stepped up and said that one of his students had gone in there. Samantha Parks was walking across the track, heading for her first class, when she stopped and looked at the playground. It was like something had entranced her, and she walked slowly away from the track and headed into the playground. "Has anyone gone in after her?" I asked, afraid the birds might hurt her. The others shook their heads, and I felt a rage building in me as I dropped my bag and walked towards the playground. Crows or no crows, I was not going to let a student get injured without trying to help them. Mr. Simonson caught my arm as I tried to go in. He won't like it if you disturb him," he whispered, looking ashamed that he had said it. "Who?" I asked, squaring my shoulders and looking at him darkly. "The Crow Count?" He looked surprised that I knew the name, but when he let me go, I walked straight onto the playground and away from the pack of cowards. The crows watched me, hostility in their beady eyes, but they made no move to attack me as I walked amongst them. It was exactly like my dream. The crows covered everything, their numbers having risen in 3 days since they had been here. Their murder was huge, the equipment looking like a giant crow as they sat on every empty surface. It was a mass of wings and feathers and beady black eyes, and I walked within that heaving black sea of avians. I came to the center far too soon. He was standing on a merry-go-round, the metal battered and the paint faded and chipped. It looked as if it had been moved through time, and he stood in the middle of it as it turned ever so slowly. The crows guarded him, leaning closer as if making ready to charge me if I tried to attack him, and he seemed utterly at ease. He was dressed in the same black hat with feathers around the brim, the same black coat, dark as a raven's wing, and the same leather boots that looked like they had walked across the ages to be here. He looked like he could have known Vlad Tepes, like he could have watched an original Shakespeare play, could have wielded a knife as it slew Caesar. He was ageless, an engine of destruction as much as the one he stood upon, and as he turned, I saw the girl kneeling on the hot top. She was tall for 10, looking like a woman more than a child, and when I took a step towards her, the man spoke.
Do not touch what belongs to the crows.
I stopped, despite myself, and as I looked up, I finally got a look at him. His face was young, his hair a perfect salt and pepper, and his features were sharp and angular. He looked like a painting in a museum, a man out of time, and as he came fully around, he looked like nothing so much as a demon in human form. His eyes, however, were what drew me the most. They sparkled, the cornea like the facets of a gem. No wonder the crows followed him. His eyes were something they would desire above all else, and I wondered if they would take them from him when his life finally came to an end. Somehow, despite being captivated by this strange man, I found the courage to speak. She does not belong to you. She is of this school and under its protection, under my protection. The man sneered at me.
You would dare tell me what treasures I may take? This is my domain, and I take what I want.
Not today, I said, and the girl shook off whatever spell she had been under and began to hyperventilate. Where am I? She asked, and I tried my best to calm her down. That seemed to be what the crows were waiting for. They flew at us suddenly, buffeting the two of us with their wings and raking at us with their claws. Crows may not seem very formidable, but they're bigger than you think, and there were so many of them that it was all I could do to pick her up and run in a direction. As long as it was away from the crow count, I didn't give a damn where I went. I pushed the girl in front of me, leading her through the throng of crows and getting pretty cut up in the process. I heard her scream as I covered her with my body, putting a hand over my face as I tried to save my eyes. We were running blind, bumping into things and rebounding back before we chose a different way. I felt like we would never make it out, that the crows would bury us under their mass and just carry us away. I didn't think I'd ever see my class, my students, or anything ever again, and that was when I stumbled out of the cloud and out of the playground. I lay on the ground, covering myself, but the crows were gone. I was breathing heavily, reaching for the girl to reassure her, but she wasn't there. I looked around trying to find her, but she was just gone. Where was she? Had she escaped? What had... But that was when I heard a massive push of wings and the raised voice of the murder. As I looked up, they all took flight at once, ascending into the sky in a great wave of black wings. In the middle of the cloud, held between the claws of many, many crows, were a pair of people that were soon lost amongst the cloud. one in a tall hat and cloak, and another in the uniform our students wore. All I could do was watch them go, the tears coming as the murder took flight and left our playground behind. The other teachers came up then, helping me to my feet as they took me to the office. The principal was expecting me, and she told me to take a seat as the nurse came in to treat the multiple cuts and abrasions I had. I'm sorry you had to learn about this way. It's why we don't often hire outsiders. They don't understand, and it gets many of them killed, or worse. I had 1,000 questions, but I was in shock, and I couldn't vocalize any of them. The Crow Count is part of the town's history. He's something that has always existed, and always will. He comes, he takes, he leaves. In the years he does not take, we celebrate. In the years when he does, we mourn. That's why we have the crow warnings, why we teach our kids to be on their guard, and why the parents are so fearful. We know he will take if we give him the chance. There's nothing we can do about it. The Crow Count is old and clever, and nothing will stop him. Best to accept it. He never takes more than we can afford. I wondered if the parents I saw consoling each other as I went to leave would agree that the price had been something they could afford. I'm sitting in my apartment now, and I'm 3 sheets to the wind. I don't know if I can keep teaching here, knowing that the Crow Count will be back again, but I don't know what else I would do. I love my job, and I love the kids, and if I can keep them safe, then don't I owe that to them? Also, I want to know more about this thing. I want to know what it is, and how it came to be here. Also, I want to know why it takes them, and what it does with them when it has them. Above all else, I want to know how we can stop it from happening, and stop the crows from stealing what is most precious to us. Sorry, kiddo. That's not something I like to talk about. We were at the breakfast table, and Dad looked away as he let the pancake piece slide off his fork. Mom looked equally as unhappy, and she suddenly remembered that it was almost time for us to get going before we were late. She grabbed up my plate, my own breakfast mostly gone, and I went to grab my stuff so we could head out. Terry had been right. The look on Dad's face was something like fear congealing into paranoia. I could understand that fear, especially if Dad had been approached in the same way I had yesterday. But surely he didn't think I was in cahoots with the sheriff or the mayor. Terry had looked nervous when I went to tell him about the meeting. He asked me if everything was okay when I came back, and when I told him I needed to come in and talk, he let me in straight to the basement. In the bowels of the house, floor above and walls around, I told him what had happened, and he seemed to like it about as much as I did. Crap. I had hoped he wouldn't figure out what we were working on for a while. I knew the second we started moving in the open together, it was only a matter of time. Damn it, I thought we had longer. What do we do? I asked, not really sure what to make of this. Intrigue isn't something I'm used to. I just spent 2 years in a place where the enemy shot at you and put bombs on the road. This cloak and dagger stuff wasn't my style. Nothing, Terry said. We just act carefully. As far as they know, you're just helping me. You didn't give them anything incriminating, did you? I shook my head, hoping it was true. Then as far as they know, you're just assisting me with my book. They can do some shady things in this town, but they can't act without purpose. Not yet. I'm a well-liked person in this community, and you're a war hero for all intents and purposes. If either of us just up and vanished, then there'd be a lot of questions, and a lot of people looking for us. So we just continue to be well-liked, noticeably present, and keep pressing our luck, I guess. He'd taken me home then, and I'd been stewing about it until I finally slipped off that night. I needed that information, sooner rather than later. The ride to the yard was quiet, and I felt I needed to break the tension before Dad thought too much about it. Hey, I didn't mean to stir anything up. I knew it was town history, but I didn't realize it was a sore subject. Dad just continued to drive for a few more blocks, collecting his thoughts before he cleared his throat and nodded. No problem, kiddo. Why do you want to know about that anyway? Some of the guys at work ask you about it? Nah, it was Susan's Uncle Terry. He's writing a book about the Forresters. Well, Forrester-related town history, and I'm kind of helping him. He asked me if I knew anything about it, since you were part of it. Dad nodded. Yeah, I heard he was writing something like that. I know he's been collecting stories, but I think he'd do better to leave this one alone. A word of advice, too. Don't ask Garza about it either. What we saw out there is better forgotten. That's been made pretty clear. I wanted to ask him what he meant by that, but he pulled into the parking lot then and told me to have a great day as he rolled out for the yard. Despite his advice, I supposed I would need to speak to Garza about it if I wanted any answers. Dad had been evasive, but Garza wasn't so subtle. I took the front seat when the truck came in, begging Derek to let me have it, even though it was his turn. He shrugged, telling me I'd owe him one, and took a spot in the back. Waited till we got to the outskirts, another neighborhood in need of a sprucing up, and as everyone piled out, I asked the boss if I could have a word before we got started. He nodded, telling Ramsey to make sure everyone got to their assignments, and he closed the door again. "What's up, kid?" he asked, his old face stretching into a smile. "Need some time off or something? I can't pay you for it, but the least I can do is make sure they don't fill your spot." I shook my head. "Nothing like that. I needed to ask if you'd be willing to talk about something, maybe after work sometime." "About?" he asked, his smile slipping a little. "I'm helping Terry Bremen, the town historian, with a book he's writing, a collection of histories, and he's interested in—" "No," he said, all traces of good cheer gone from him. It's just an account of—" "I know what he wants," Garza said, his eyes distrustful. "And you tell Terry he's a coward for sending one of my own guys to try and get it from me. That's not town history, that's personal, and I don't want to hear about it again. I won't hold it against you because, well, you didn't know, and I had already told him no, but I don't want it brought up again. Do we have an understanding?" I nodded, not wanting to push, but knowing I would have to. I climbed out of the truck, but he sat there for a while after I'd gone to get started, clearly ruffled. As I worked that day, I tried to find some reason to learn what Terry needed. There were only 2 people who could tell me, and they had both made it pretty clear they didn't want to talk about it. How was I going to figure out what Terry wanted to know? It wasn't like there were a lot of other people who knew. No one alive, at least. Derek came over during lunch, wanting to know what all that had been about, and I told him it was nothing. "Nothing, hell. Garza's been in a foul mood since you talked to him. He yelled at me earlier for cutting too close to the power pole, and sounded like he would have liked to say more." He had his voice pitched as low as Derek ever did, and I was kind of afraid that people would hear him. "It's nothing. Something someone asked me to ask him. Don't worry about it." The boss's mood didn't improve for the next couple of days, and the improvement cost him dearly. Thursday rolled around, and I still wasn't any closer to figuring out how to get them talking. Garza had been actively avoiding me, and he must have said something to Dad because he was uncharacteristically quiet. If he saw me coming into a room, he always had something to do somewhere else, and last night he had stayed in his room saying he didn't feel well. Chatter was at an all-time low amongst the crew, and they seemed to think I had done something to set Garza off. I couldn't help but notice the cold shoulders I'd been receiving lately, and I suppose I probably deserved it, but they didn't know that. After lunch on Thursday, I went back to my post to find that Garza was already cutting on a tree I'd been putting off. It was this big, gnarly-looking fern gully tree. It was thick around the middle, and both myself and Derek had tried to cut it down without much luck. I saw he had one of those heavy-duty chainsaws, the kind you could use to cut through a metal pipe if you wanted to mess up your blade, and he was making progress, though slowly. I went back to cutting down the normal-sized trees, the ones that were less likely to contain an ancient spirit just looking for freedom, and as I stacked up the little shrub trees, I noticed the smoke. First, I thought it was just exhaust from Garza's saw, but as it kept coming, I saw it was too much for one saw. It was coming in like errant clouds, and I looked around to see who was stupid enough to try to burn something this close to the woods. Maybe someone had burnt up a saw and it had caught in the grass, or someone had tossed a cigarette into something dry. But there was no fire. There was nothing that made the smoke, and I started thinking that it might not be smoke. I was having flashbacks of the day my brother had gone missing, and I realized too late that it was fog. I put down my saw and sat, keeping still as it grew thicker around me. That's when I realized that I could still hear Garza's saw. He hadn't noticed. I started to keep my seat. Surely he would notice soon, but as it got thicker and the saw persisted, I knew he wasn't paying attention to it. He had the tunnel vision, his focus on the task at hand, and he likely thought the fog was just exhaust off his chainsaw. The foresters would creep up on him at this rate, and he'd never see them coming, not unless I did something unwise. I crawled slowly towards the place where the tree had been to try to get to him. The fog had been patchy a few minutes ago, but now it was like traveling through a cloud. The tree I was after should have been less than 20 feet from me, but in this fog I might as well have been in a different country. I was worried that I might get turned around for a moment, but as the back of his safety vest came into view, I tugged on it to get his attention. I didn't dare yell. I had to trust that he would notice when he looked up and cut the engine in time to avoid being dragged off. I must have startled him, though, because he jerked suddenly and the saw came back at him. I didn't know if his leg had gone to sleep or he just slipped, but when he fell back, the saw came back with him and it bit into his leg just below the knee. There was blood, but the doctor would tell me later that he was lucky it hadn't been higher. If it had gone up and into his knee, he might have never walked again, and as it was, it just cut him to the bone. It sounded like it took longer than it did, but it happened in a matter of seconds. 1 minute he was up and cutting, and the next he was down on the ground, the blood running down the denim of his jeans. The saw, thankfully, went off as soon as he stopped squeezing the throttle, and after grunting unhappily on its side for a minute, it cut off. In the meantime, his leg was pouring blood, and he was blowing like an injured elephant. I was left in the fog bank, my boss shaking and yelling as the shadows crouched on the edge of the woods. They too had snuck up on us as I tried to get his attention, and I had to think quickly. My safety vest came off, and I wrapped it as tight as I could around the wound. My bandana came down into his mouth, and as he looked up at me, I put a finger to my lips and bent down to put pressure on the wound. If we both stayed still, just for a little while, maybe they would move on, and we could get Garza some help. He seemed to realize what I was doing and tried to lay as still as he could. He was still convulsing a little, shaking, gasps that racked his whole body, and I heard his quiet sobs against the handkerchief. They moved in the fog like phantoms, and I closed my eyes as the blood soaked through my work gloves. We had to stay still. We had to stay undetected, and when I heard the people calling out to us after an eternity in the fog, I opened my eyes to see that it had all passed. Garza and I were lying beside the big misshapen tree, and the fog was gone, along with its passengers. The others were calling us, and now that the danger had passed, I looked down and noticed how pale he was, and how wet my hands were. I called out, and they came on the run. We had a better bandage on by the time the ambulance got there, and they loaded him into the back with practiced hands. They said he had lost a lot of blood, but He was tough, and he would likely pull through once they got him to the hospital. I hadn't had a doubt, because despite how soaked his pants and my vest had been, his eyes had never closed, and they had roamed constantly as if trying to make sure the danger was gone. He hadn't closed his eyes until he was in the ambulance, and only then did he really seem to relax. I watched it roll away, and as Ramsey came to clap me on the shoulder, I knew I'd been forgiven. "That's 2 of us you've saved now. If they ever try to reassign you, there might be a fight." Ramsey led the group for a while, but he assured us that Garza would make a full recovery. His injuries were serious, and he'd lost a lot of blood, but he was expected to recover. "He's a tough old bastard," Ramsey joked, having gone to see him every day after work. "He asked me to ask you to come to see him later." He told me after work on Monday. I figured I knew what it was about, and when I went to the hospital to visit him, he told me to close the door. His leg was wrapped in a bandage, a bag beside him pumping antibiotics into his arm, but he looked better than he had in the woods that day. His color was back to normal, and his usual smile was back, if not a little sad. "I owe you my life," he said, not even waiting till I sat down. "Don't mention it. I don't think you would have cut yourself at all if I hadn't startled you." "Nope. I'd have been dragged off by the damn foresters, and that would have been a fate worse than death. You saved my life. I owe you something." "So," he looked like someone had fed him a lemon, "I'm going to tell you what happened during the fire of '95. "Sir, you don't have..." But he put a hand up. "You may not record it, because I don't want anyone knowing that I was the one that told you. But I will tell you the story, and then you're free to do with it what you will. Be aware, if anyone hears you talking about it, they will assume your father told you, and they won't like it. I think you already know there are elements in this town that would like certain parts of our town history redacted. This is one of those pieces of history. Get comfy. This one's a long one." I sat there for 2 hours, listening to the tale of what a previous mayor had done in the woods nearly 30 years ago. A mayor whose actions would seal the fate of 8 other men and himself. Okay, so here's everything you need for that New York Times best-selling novel. I've got all the lore, the layout, everything you should need to bring it off. Mr. Torrance leafed through the notebook, shaking his head as he blew out a long breath. "Thomas, this is amazing. Why aren't you using these ideas? You've sold me so many fantasy novels. Why not cash in yourself?" Thomas snorted into his macchiato. "What's wrong, Mr. T? You tired of being on the bestseller list?" No, God, no, but..." The old guy thought about it for a minute before answering. "Why not publish these yourself? Why sell them to me?" Thomas shrugged. "Honestly, I don't have the drive to sit down and turn them all into novels. I like coming up with the concepts and writing the lore, but whenever I try to write them down, I get bored and just come up with more concepts. They're better in your hands, man." Mr. Torrance looked to see if he was joking, and shook his head as he took out his checkbook and wrote Thomas the agreed-upon sum. "I swear, Thomas, you might be the best writer who doesn't write I've ever met." Thomas smiled and put the check in his wallet. "Thanks. Tell your friends." He was still smiling when he walked out of the bank an hour later, the bills paid for the next 4 months, and all for a couple of hours of work. Torrance would write another book and go on talk shows and sign autographs, and Thomas would pay his bills, go on dates, and generally live his life. There were people out there who would have been angry at this, but not Thomas. Thomas had seen what the spotlight does to people, and he didn't want it. Thomas O'Hare, son of Jack O'Hare, had seen the devastation of rising to the top. As a child, he had told his father endless stories about knights and elves, spacemen and terrible aliens, about haunted houses and mysterious lands, and his father had soaked it all up like a sponge. Jack O'Hare had been a middling writer, a struggling columnist, and a mediocre father, but Thomas had loved sitting in his study, telling him stories. "That's great, Tommy boy," his father would say, writing and writing and writing, as his son told him tales of everything and anything. When his father had written Watchtower, a story about the knights who manned the watchtowers of Elise and protected them from the dragons and elves that roamed the desert, he'd made a cool 90,000 off it, and another 50 for the rights to the short miniseries. Thomas remembered watching it on TV and was happy that his daddy had brought his story to life. By the time he was 15, Thomas began to understand what was going on. His father had written a book a year since he was 4, sold ideas and multiple pitches to producers, and they had come up in the world quite a bit. Thomas was also aware that his mother suspected that the visits to writers' conventions were an excuse to sleep with strange women in new cities. She had caught him at it more than once, the partners usually young enough to remember high school, but Thomas's father always said the same thing. "Go on then, Maggie, leave me. Take the boy and whatever the court decides you get and live in some shitty little apartment with a shitty little car and a shitty little life. I'm making the big bucks here, and you want to be with the man who makes the big bucks, 'cause he buys the good stuff. Do you really think Tommy is going to want to live in some rundown shack when he can stay with me in luxury? Keep dreaming." She had stayed, but Thomas hadn't. His father had raged when he told him. By then, he'd been into a habit that was eating up his savings quicker than he could pitch ideas. But Thomas said his ideas had dried up. He didn't have anything for his old man, and as the money ran out, so had all the rest. No more talk shows, no more book signings, no more conventions, and certainly no more 20-somethings sniffing around for scraps. The fortunes of Jack O'Hare had dwindled, but Thomas's were just starting to build. His father had fallen into obscurity, and Thomas had begun selling his ideas to people who would appreciate them, and the one writing them. He'd put his poor mother up somewhere after he'd convinced her to leave his father in the pit that he'd dug for himself, and now he only heard from his dear old dad in the slowly deteriorating voicemails he left him. Thomas wasn't sorry for what he'd done. His father was a leech, and eventually, leeches got squished. "Hey T, you got that?" "Right here, Ray," Thomas said, tossing him a thumb drive. "That's all the research, sources, and footnotes you'll need for your thesis." Raymond cackled, pumping his fist as he jumped the back of the couch and landed beside Thomas. "T, how do you do this? You're like a genie or something. I just make a wish and sim sim salabim," he intoned and extended his fingers. "Like magic." Thomas shrugged as he made a disgusted noise. This was the 4th time he had tried to kill this boss, and he was getting a little tired of dying. "I don't know, Ray. It's like a mutant superpower or something. I always just know what people need. Stories, information, whatever. They need it, I have it. They pay for it, and I provide it." "Speaking of," Raymond said, taking out his wallet, but Thomas put a hand out. "Not for you, Ray. Taking your money would be like eating your leftovers. Satisfying, but not wholly helpful." Ray chuckled. "And the fact that once I get my doctorate, I'll be making enough to pay for our apartment 3 times over has nothing to do with this?" "It might. I'm sure I can't keep this up forever, and I might need someone in high places to help me out someday." Raymond took the controller from him as he died again. "Don't worry about that, T. You know I've always got your back," he said, killing the boss fairly easily before handing it back to Thomas. Thomas reflected that it had always been like that with them. He and Raymond had known each other since elementary school, and they had felt drawn together in a way that he couldn't explain. Thomas needed Raymond to ground him, and Raymond needed Thomas to give him stability. Thomas always seemed to have the resources that Ray needed to succeed, and Raymond had the drive and the ambition that Thomas seemed to be missing. Raymond would go places, Thomas knew, and Thomas would follow because he liked to watch Raymond soar. When Thomas had left home at 16 so he didn't have to watch his father's decline, Raymond's family had been more than happy to take him in. When Raymond needed help getting into med school, Thomas had helped him with his tuition. The two were there for each other, always had been, and Thomas saw no reason for it to stop now. His phone vibrated, and he hit pause as he pulled it out and checked the message. Tomorrow at 2 at Jilly Beans. That's not ominous or anything, Raymond said, glancing over his shoulder. It's just business. It's nothing illegal, as you know. Raymond shook his head. True, but it never gets any less weird. Thomas smiled as he continued his quest through the bleak landscapes of Dark Souls 2. Raymond wasn't wrong, but damn, was it lucrative. Thomas arrived early, got himself a coffee, and took a seat in the booth by the wall where he usually sat. Jilly Beans was one of his usual spots, and the owner nodded at him as they locked eyes. He liked it here. The ambience was very old school, and Thomas enjoyed smelling the grinding beans, hearing the machines as they brewed, and listening to the chatter around him. He pulled his phone out and let the buyer know that he was here, making some notes on his phone about a new idea that he'd had on the way. Pirates, a mysterious island, sunken ships, ghost fleets, and a treasure beneath the waves. It had Summer Blockbuster written all over it. He looked up as someone took a seat, grimacing as he looked back down at his phone just as fast. I'm meeting someone. If you want to buy ideas, you'll have to make an appointment. I'm afraid your client won't be arriving, said the fellow in the tailored suit, his sleek black hair held under a bowler hat, which he sat on the table. Oh, and why might that be? Because we made them a better deal in exchange for when and where they were meeting you. You, as it happens, are a hard man to track down, Thomas O'Hare. Thomas was a little startled that the man knew his name, but he hid it well. You've gone through a lot of trouble to find me. I'm guessing you're, what, IRS, feds? I can assure you that all my money is made legally, and I'm not paying taxes on it. I make it through my own sweat and efforts, so you can... No, Mr. O'Hare. I work for someone who is, let's say, morally gray, but even we aren't that evil. No, I represent someone who has a mutual interest in your enterprise. Thomas lifted an eyebrow. I didn't know what I had was an enterprise. Oh, yes. Quite a lucrative one, actually, said the young man in the suit. And I suppose you and your boss are looking to invest, is that it? Quite the contrary. We'd like you to stop. Thomas blinked at him. What? To stop, to cease, to end what you're doing. You see, my employer has been doing it for a very long time, and you are encroaching on his business. Thomas looked at him for a few seconds before he started to chuckle. He expected the kid would pick it up, but no such luck. He just sat there, smiling politely, waiting for Thomas to get it out. You're joking, right? This is a joke, right? The man shook his head. Afraid not. My employer is very serious. Look, I don't know who your employer is, Mr. Lucifer, the man said, and Thomas's eyes got very big. No, not that one. Lucifer T. Jones, acquisitions officer for Libris Talent. We acquire talent from those who cannot utilize it properly, but we also sell that talent to those in need of it. You're selling the fruits of your talent, something we simply can't have. We will be very happy to pay you for your talent, but you monopolizing such a vast talent in this way is unacceptable. Thomas gave Lucifer a skeptical look. And if I decide not to sell it to you? Lucifer went right on smiling, but it was less friendly than it had been. Well then, we would have no choice but to lean on you, disrupt your business, make things very difficult for you. Thomas scoffed, getting up as he glowered at Lucifer. Good luck with that. I sell ideas, sir, and the need for ideas is always high. Lucifer pulled a hand out of his pocket so quickly that Thomas almost saw the gun he expected to be there. There was no way. Was this well-dressed man just going to blow him away right here in Jilly Beans? It was unthinkable. He'd never get away with it. Was his boss this serious about profit margins? He had slitted his eyes, waiting for the pain, but when he opened them, he saw the business card in the young man's hand, a startling cream color against his dark skin. in case you change your mind. A talent like yours would be at a premium, to be sure." Thomas walked off without taking the card, but found it later in his wallet. Whoever this Lucifer Jones was, he was more than met the eye. "Mr. Sorrells, you told me you were looking for fantasy?" The man was not one of his usual clients, but Thomas couldn't turn down business. He had several fantasy drafts that would grow into novels worth a mint, and if Mr. Sorrells had the cash, Thomas had the ideas. Sorrells, for his part, looked like someone interested in something different. He was sweaty, very shaky, and did a lot of smiling. "Yeah, definitely. What kind of novels do you have?" "Well, I have this. It's called The Kingdom of Elwith. It's a marriage intrigue about..." Yeah, that sounds great. Hey, let's walk a bit as we talk. It's hard to hear you in here, and I want all the details before I make my decision." Thomas looked around, growing a little wary of the man and his shaky smile. Ground Level, another of his favorite coffee shops, was mostly empty, and the noise was at an acceptable level. Why did this guy want to stroll and talk? It was likely to be louder on the sidewalk than in here. Something wasn't adding up here, and Thomas didn't like it. "Look, Mr. Sorrells, if you want the material, then it's $3,500, non-negotiable. My work generally brings in 10 times what I charge, and this one has real potential. I'm sure you've heard about my previous clients and the quality of my stories. So, do we have a deal or not?" Mr. Sorrells kept looking at the door, his smile looking sickly, and when Thomas glanced that way, he felt like someone was watching from across the street. It wasn't the smiling Lucifer Jones either. This man was corpsey, a man-thing in a tailored suit, and his eyes were flinty as it smiled that rictus of a grin. I just don't know. That's a lot of money, and I think we should talk about it more. The weather's so nice, and..." But Thomas had heard enough. He got up, and to his surprise, the man grabbed his arm. It was more like a request than a demand, but Thomas pulled away and practically ran for the door. This wasn't his normal sale, and he didn't like the feel of it. The guy was trying to lure him off, and suddenly Thomas wanted nothing so much as to be back in the safety of his apartment, with the door locked and the world kept at bay. "Wait!" the man said shrilly, but Thomas was already away. The specter was gone, but as he went home, Thomas felt eyes on him nonetheless. It was something he would become used to in the coming weeks. Thomas was walking home that night when a van pulled slowly along behind him. His hands were full of groceries, just a few things for the house, and he was shaking his head as he thought about the weirdo at Ground Level. What the hell had that been about? He'd had guys try to stiff him on payment, bounce their checks on purpose, or what have you, but Sorrells had almost tried to grab him. What had he hoped to accomplish, Thomas wondered? Had Lucifer put some kind of bounty on his head? And what if he had? The money couldn't have been worth getting caught, and Thomas couldn't imagine a talent company would be that interested in him. The van was pulling up next to him, and Thomas turned to look just as the yawning mouth of the van's side door slid open, and hands reached out for him. They weren't even bothering with masks, and the faces he saw didn't exactly look like the kind of fellows who snatched people off the street. They were pale, disheveled, and looked a lot like Sorrells had. He would have thought them junkies, but he'd worked with writers long enough to know the look. These were academics, not kidnappers, but the hands that reached out to take hold of him were strong and determined, nonetheless. Thomas swung his grocery bag at them, breaking the pasta sauce and rupturing his milk as he fought them off. They fell back, not expecting his barrage of foodstuffs, and as they did, Thomas took off. The van screeched to life, but he was cutting down a shortcut before they could catch up to him. His adrenaline was up, and Thomas was showing his heels. He didn't stop until the door was secure behind him, and when it was, he crumpled into a ball, his fear coursing through him like a drug. Thomas swung his eyes from side to side, looking more like a scared deer than his usual self. The last 2 weeks had been a nightmare that Thomas was unable to wake up from. It hadn't ended with the attempted kidnapping from the van. Most of his clients had either stopped answering or seemed far too interested in meeting him. Their messages were not the ones he'd received before, and they were full of empty platitudes and strange desires to meet in places Thomas didn't usually meet his clients. After the incident at ground level, Thomas was hesitant to meet people, and his business suffered because of it. He'd felt hunted when he left the apartment, and not just by people on the street. The eyes of that strange cadaverous thing seemed to follow him, and Thomas was beginning to think that this might be the benefactor that Lucifer Jones had spoken of. So he stopped going out. Thomas had plenty of funds. He didn't need to sell for a while. He could just wait for this to blow over. It was no big deal. It would end soon, and he could return to business as usual. Then, today, Raymond texted him and said he had left his books at home. "Hey, left my chem book at home. Can you bring them to the chem lab for me by 6? Thanks, man." The message was fairly mundane. Thomas wouldn't have risked it, but Ray was close to graduation, and he needed to keep his grades up if he was going to get his doctorate. Every face on the street seemed more menacing than the last, and Thomas kept his head down and his cap pulled low as he approached the university. In and out, quick and easy. Then he could get back to the apartment and lock all the locks and feel better in his mind. He would be safe there. He was always safe there. And as he entered the Heisman building, he made his way to the chem lab. He was nearly there, the door in sight, when a familiar voice called out to him. "T, what are you doing here?" Thomas exhaled in relief. "There you are. Here, I got your chem book like you asked for." Raymond seemed confused. "Thanks, but chem isn't till Thursday." "You sent me a text and said you needed it," Thomas said, glancing back at the lab door and only now noticing that only the emergency lights were on inside. "Nope. In fact, I lost my phone earlier. I haven't sent any texts all day. Must have been a wrong number, bud. Sorry." Thomas felt his breath quicken. If he looked carefully, he thought he could see the shadows against the wall. What were they planning to do? Were they going to take him to the Shadow Man? To turn him in for some kind of reward? What the hell was this? Thomas had never felt so pursued in his entire life, and he didn't like it. "T, you okay?" He jumped when Raymond touched his shoulder, but he nodded hastily. God, they had stolen Ray's phone. They could have just as easily hurt him, but they hadn't. It seemed they hadn't become that desperate. Yet. Would they stop with the phone next? Would they hurt Raymond to get to him? If they kidnapped Thomas, then would they really stop it? I gotta go, Thomas said, rushing off as he ignored Ray's calls from behind him. He had the business card out before he hit the sidewalk, the numbers tripping over themselves as he dialed. "Mr. O'Hare," said the smooth voice of Lucifer Jones, "we've been waiting for you. Meet me at Jilly Beans in 30 minutes. I don't want to be accosted by anyone either. I know you have something to do with this, and if it will put an end to it, then I'm willing to deal." Of course. I'll be there in 30 minutes, but I think it might be better if I met you somewhere safer, somewhere you would feel secure. Your apartment, maybe." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, feeling the eyes on him already. They were hungry, and they knew there would be something to gain from taking him now. Would they try to grab him right here on the street? Thomas didn't know, but he suspected the prize was grand enough to make them sloppy. "Fine, 30 minutes at my apartment. Don't be late, or the deal's off." As he hung up, he heard several phones chirp all at once. He was running again, figuring Lucifer had let them know the deal was off. He wanted to be far away before they decided the deal might be back on if they went ahead and grabbed him. He wanted to be well away before they found their nerve. Unsurprisingly, Lucifer was waiting for him when he arrived. "I assumed you wanted to get this over with. Shall we?" Thomas opened the door, and despite wanting to slam it in his face, He let Lucifer Jones into his sanctuary. I'm glad you came to your senses. We wouldn't want any unpleasantness over this. What do I need to do? Thomas said, not in the mood for veiled threats or pleasantries. Just sign your name here, Lucifer said, taking out a thick leather book and opening it to the front page, and it will all be over. The book was thick, old, bound in what could have been leather or human skin. Thomas couldn't explain it, but the book felt like it was watching him. It was a hateful old thing, the kind of book that Faust had signed, he was sure, and he didn't like the sight of it on his coffee table any more than he liked the man holding it in his apartment. And this is what? Thomas said, shuddering a little as he looked at the book. A contract, a very special one. Sign this, and all your troubles go away. We pay you for your talent, and you never have to worry about us ever again. Thomas felt his hand freeze as he took up the pen. What was he doing? If he couldn't sell his ideas, he would just be one more person, grinding themselves down a little at a time. He had money saved, but it wouldn't last. He couldn't do this. There had to be another way. He thought of Raymond, though, and that made it easier. Besides, he thought, as he signed the book, he could always find a way around this. He still had his ideas, and that was what mattered. To his surprise, the pen went right on moving across the page. It wrote out the story he had been preparing to sell that day at the coffee shop, all of it in a matter of minutes, and moved on to another. The pages turned, drinking his words, and Thomas was helpless to stop it. What the hell? What is this? Your talent, Lucifer said, and it will make quite an addition to our catalog. The pen took it all, the fantasy, the sci-fi, the horror, the noir, everything. It felt like days passed as the sun darkened and lightened behind the windows of his living room. His hand cramped, his fingers crabbed, but he wrote on. The book grew fangs and terrible eyes, and still he wrote. It took it all, every word, and before he blacked out, the image of Lucifer Jones and his predatory smile were engraved across his psyche forever. Raymond came home that night and found him collapsed on the couch and took him to the hospital. Thomas woke up 3 days later to find an IV in his arm and a worried Raymond by his side. You scared me, he said, hugging him as if to make sure he was real. What the hell happened? Dunno, Thomas lied hoarsely, but one look at his bank account told him all he needed to know. His lost talent had made him a several times millionaire overnight, but his biggest surprise was still to come. As Thomas lay on the couch weeks later, watching some drivel on television, he winced as a spark shot through his mind. It was a thought, an idea, and he grabbed his phone and took notes. Whatever Lucifer had done hadn't taken everything. They had got his ideas, his trade goods, but they hadn't drained the well. The ideas were rusty, nothing to brag about, but they were a start. Thomas had a seed, and he knew that in time his garden might grow again. And this time, I won't be so quick to sell it, he promised, smiling as the ideas began to take root again. My grandpa was an odd guy. He was clearly wealthy, but no one was ever sure how. He lived frugally in a small house on 1/4 of an acre, with a sensible car and nothing too fancy in the house. If you'd driven past it, you would have assumed that some old-timer on a pension was just moldering away his golden years there. And you'd have been right, in some ways. Where he showed his wealth was in his generosity. Grandpa liked to give. He gave the best Christmas presents. He had the best candy for Halloween, donated to charities, and liked to see people happy. If you asked him how he could afford to be so generous, however, he would always just wink and say he had his ways. Not even my grandmother knew where his money came from, and they were married for 50 years. So when he died, we all wondered who would inherit his mysterious fortune. My cousins had loved Grandpa. Grandkids always do, but the two of us had always been close. My old man hadn't even waited till I was born to go grab some milk and cigarettes, and Grandma and Grandpa had helped my mom raise me so she could go to work. I have a lot of fond memories of sitting with Grandpa and watching TV, taking walks around the neighborhood, and eating ice cream at this little shop on the corner. He would always tell me to appreciate the little things, because the smallest things could be the ones that changed your life forever. "Take this," he would say, showing me the door knocker that he often carried in his pocket. "I found this when I was young, sifting through trash in a landfill as I looked for bottles to sell. It became my lucky charm, and it changed my life forever." Grandpa carried that door knocker for as long as I had known him, and it was pretty unique. It was a brass hand holding an apple, and it was all meticulously crafted in exhausting detail. The fingers had individual nails, the apple had a stem and leaves, and even the knuckles had wrinkles on them that had been carefully worked. I couldn't believe as a young child that Grandpa had just pulled this out of a dump, but he carried it everywhere, and I suppose it did bring him luck. The funeral was beautiful, everyone there having nothing but kind words for Grandpa and his family. After the service, my 3 cousins and I were asked to come to a will reading at the lawyer's office, and Grandpa had been as generous in death as he was in life. My cousins had received a trust fund for each of them, the amount payable on their 30th birthday, with a small living expense each month. Grandpa hadn't left a trust for me, but he had left me his little house, which I was pretty glad for. Mom had recently married, and though I liked Mike a lot, it had seemed a little odd to have her adult son living in the house that she was trying to make a new life in. Grandpa's old house was the perfect size for me, a college student with no real prospects of marriage in the near future. It was close enough to campus that I thought it would be ideal, but the lawyer had one more thing to give me. "Your grandfather was also very clear that I give you this," he said, and he handed me Grandpa's lucky charm, the brass door knocker. I thanked him, thinking I might hang it somewhere in the house in Grandpa's memory. It seemed only fitting to make a little memorial wall out of it. After all, Grandpa had loved the thing, and it had been his only constant possession for years. So I moved in that day, taking my things and wishing my mom and stepdad goodbye as I too embarked on a new life. Over the next few days, I changed the house around a little. I hung my flat screen on the wall, I moved Grandpa's favorite armchair around, I added my books to his bookshelf, and I donated his clothes and some of his other things to one of his favorite charities. I think Grandpa would have liked the thought that his stuff would help people in need, and they were very thankful. A few of them offered condolences, having read about his death in the paper. Grandpa bought a lot of his stuff from Goodwill and Habitat for Humanity, but he also donated a lot, so he was well known to them. It was Friday, about 4 days after the funeral, when I noticed the knocker on the counter and remembered my plan to hang it and make a memorial wall. I didn't have anything else planned for that day, so it seemed like a fine pursuit. I hung the knocker in the living room, putting it above the little shelf where I put some candles and a picture of Granddad. I put his wallet up there too, something else he was never without, and I added a tin of Altoids, a pocket watch I'd seen him wear, and a few other pictures of him. The door knocker was the centerpiece, and it all looked very nice when I was done. As I finished, I stepped back and admired it, thinking that Grandpa would have liked it too. That night was the first time I heard the knocking. I was lying in bed, doing some doom scrolling before I went to sleep, when suddenly I heard a loud thump from the living room. I took out my earbuds and listened. wondering if something had fallen over or maybe someone was at the door. But I didn't hear anything. I shrugged, thinking it had been my imagination, but just before I could slip the earbud back in, I heard it again. 3 long booms from the living room, then silence. I got up, wondering who could be knocking at my door at this time of night, and went to the front door and looked out the peephole. I opened the door to see if someone was joking around, but there was no one there. Front porch was empty. Grandpa didn't have any bushes or anything to hide behind. The kid, or whoever, would have had to been the freaking Flash to make it off the porch without being seen, and I closed the door and started to go back to bed. I'd come to the hallway that led there when I heard it again. 3 long booms, then silence. I turned back, looking at the door, but there was nothing. The knocking hadn't come from the door. I would have been able to tell. No, it had come from the living room. I glanced around, looking for someone at the window, or maybe the rattle of a woodpecker on the eaves, but there was nothing. I decided to go back to bed and try to make sense of it later, but that wasn't the last time I heard it. I heard the knocking a couple of times over the weekend, but I could never quite nail down where it was coming from. It was always either 1, 2, or 3 knocks, followed by a 10-second pause, and then the same number of knocks before it stopped. By Monday, I was pulling my hair out, wondering if this was the pipes or something in the walls. Then I finally caught it. I'd found a wedding picture of my grandparents sitting in a desk, something Grandpa had probably put away so he wouldn't miss Grandma too much, and I decided it would look very nice on the shelf with the other memories. I was adding the wedding picture beside one of Grandpa accepting an award for philanthropy when the knocking on the wall suddenly rattled and thumped. I jumped back, not sure what to make of it, but it thumped once, twice, 3 times, and was quiet for about 10 seconds. I had just thought it might be a fluke or something. Then it did it again. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence. I took it off the wall and looked for some kind of motor or something, but it's just a normal brass knocker. It happened 2 more times that day, and I was extremely curious as to what made it do it and why. I started going through Grandpa's desk, hoping for some explanation, and that's when I found the letter. It was in the middle of a ledger book, addressed to me, and it wasn't even sealed, which was unlike Grandpa. It was just a single page of notebook paper, and I was glad to see Grandpa's cramped handwriting speaking to me from the page. I hope you're enjoying the house, and I hope you found this letter in a timely manner. I'd considered leaving it to Wilson to give to you, but I thought it might be better if you came across it naturally. Also, I wanted you to receive the knocker, and Wilson may have decided to keep it if he read the letter. He's a good man, an honest man, but greed can do funny things to people. You've probably noticed by now that the door knocker taps on its own sometimes. You wouldn't believe how I discovered its power, a complete accident, but I swear that what I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. The door knocker opens to different places. Place it on a door and wait for the knocks. Once it knocks, open the door and travel to where it takes you. The knocker only has 3 destinations, but they have been of great benefit to me and our family. When it knocks, you'll have 10 seconds to open the door. The second set of knocks is the door closing, so it won't work if you catch it on the second set. One knock opens onto the treasury, a room of treasures. Coins, gems, gold, all piled to the ceiling. If anything guards it, it has never bothered me, but I'm always careful not to take too much. 2 knocks opens onto the library, a room stuffed with bookshelves. You can spend hours, days even in this place, and time won't pass outside the door. I've learned so many things here, things lost to time, and read about things that have yet to happen. 3 knocks opens onto a void, a darkness that I dare not enter. Anything you put in here will be gone. Anything. There's no ground outside it, though, so don't walk in. I'm ashamed to say that it's where I've been putting my trash, but it's also where I hid your dog, the one I said that ran away when you were young. He died suddenly, just lay over and died, and I put him in there before you woke up from your nap. I'm sorry I never told you, but you were so young when it happened that I didn't think you would mourn him for long. The knocks were never consistent, but each knock seems to come at least once a day. The 3 knocks usually come in the evening or the early afternoon. 1 knock is usually in the morning or before noon, and the 2 knocks come when it will. While you're inside, don't let the door close. I was stuck in the library for a long, long time once, and was fortunate that your uncle came along and opened the door. Time doesn't affect people the same way inside the door as it does out here, so spend as much time as you want there. If you get hurt, however, you'll be injured, so be careful. You and I have always been close, and I know that you and your cousins have speculated for years about my mysterious fortune. The knocker is yours to do with what you will, but always remember that money breeds difficulty, which is why I have always kept it a secret. Good luck. I love you, kiddo. I read through the note a few times, trying to make sense of it. There was no way. Grandpa had always been sharp, no real problems mentally, but this sounded like the ramblings of a madman or a lunatic. The knocker, however, had moved on its own, that much was true. It occurred to me that there was a way to test the rest of it, so I decided to do just that. I took the knocker off the wall where I had hung it and attached it to the closet door in the living room. It looked a little silly there, a door knocker on a door that opened onto a closet with 2 coats and a bunch of board games in it, but I wanted to be sure. It was silly, the kind of thing you read about in fairy tales, but I wanted to be sure. I had a while to wait, but it finally happened, just as I was thinking about going to bed. It was around 10:30, and I reached for the remote to turn the TV off when I heard it. 2 loud knocks, seconds apart, on the closet door. I popped up, remembering I had 10 seconds to get there, and threw the door open. I expected to find the same closet that had been there earlier. I expected this to be a joke from my grandfather. But I didn't expect to find the great library that he had talked about on the other side. It was huge, a library to rival any I'd ever seen, and the windows shone with perfect sunlight as I stood in shock. The shelves were tall, taller than the roof of the house I stood in, and they had long trestled ladders with wheels to slide along the floor. I could see a grand staircase, and I felt sure that there would be levels above the next as well. I could learn anything in there. I could learn everything in there. But I remembered what Grandpa had said about not getting closed inside, and I looked for something to prop the door open with. I saw an end table and pulled it over to put in the way, stepping inside and marveling at the space. I spent hours perusing books. There were books on languages, on history, on science, on anything I would want to know. I only explored the first floor that night, but there was enough there to keep me reading for days, maybe months. I was studying architecture at college, and there was a whole section of books I could use to study any period, any style, and anything else I wanted. This place was like the libraries they talked about in Alexandria, the libraries in the Harry Potter books, and some kind of wizard's private collection from a fantasy novel, all rolled into one. Time may have moved differently here, but it didn't stop me from getting tired. I'd been excited when I came in, but after a couple of hours, I was yawning and rubbing my eyes. I decided to come back another time and let the door close as I pushed the end table out of the way. It was true. I couldn't believe it, but I had seen it myself. Grandpa had a magic door knocker. I spent the next few days testing each knock pattern, and Grandpa's observations had been spot on. I found the room with the gold in it the next day, and it was almost more impressive than the library. Think of a room full of any kind of money you could want. Gold bars, U.S. currency, ancient denarii, little stones with things scratched on them, gems, pearls, silver nuggets, and other things I didn't even have a name for. I reached for a stack of hundreds with a shaky hand and brought them out before I let the door close again. I had made about $2,000 in a matter of seconds, and I put it somewhere safe before heading to class. The void was a little scarier when I got to it, but I'd been setting garbage bags beside the door just in case, and I was home when the knocks finally came. The void was just what it claimed to be. It was like looking out at a night sky, except there was no stars. It was an inky, unnatural blackness, and I wondered if maybe Nietzsche had been describing this place when he talked about staring into the abyss. The space was utterly devoid of anything, but it seemed to crouch as well, just waiting for me to drop my guard. The bags went in, falling into a soundless, airless void before I closed the door again. It was great for a while, truly a blessing. I had all the money I needed, and whatever I took seemed to come back after I shut the door. I could take books from the library if I needed to, and anything I left on the work tables would put itself away on the shelf. I spent a lot of time in the library when I got there, and sometimes I would wake up to find that I'd fallen asleep. The door never slammed shut and trapped me in there, and without anyone to come behind me and accidentally close it, I felt safe in there. I learned so much in a relatively short time, and my professors were impressed with my knowledge. I considered bringing them the books I'd used to gain that knowledge, but I thought better of it. How would I explain it to them? A guy in his early 20s who just happened to have a book that was probably hundreds of years old. It was something that would probably gain the attention of the wrong sort of people. I was careful not to use too much of the money, not to spread it around too much, and careful not to show anyone the books I got from the library. It went well for about 4 months, but then I started getting knocks of another sort from the door. It started subtly, with little knocks and taps from time to time. I'm sure I missed a lot of them, but I would sometimes look up as I was watching TV or reading, expecting to see the knocker tapping, but finding it silent. I started watching the door closer, getting strange lights wafting beneath it sometimes. They would skitter across the bottom like strange shadows, and I found myself watching them more than the TV after a while. My trips to the other places were still uneventful, the landscapes the same as they had always been, but it was the time in between the knocks that I came to dread. Then one night, something knocked back. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a familiar boom sound 3 times. I checked the clock and saw it was nearly 11. A little late for knocking, but I stuck my head out to look at the door nonetheless. The toothbrush was still in my mouth, and I had expected to see nothing stranger than the knocker fall back into place. Instead, something knocked again, and it wasn't the knocker. I came slowly out of the bathroom, watching as strange lights came flashing from beneath the cracks of the door. It was like a haunted house attraction, and I almost expected to see smoke billowing out from underneath it. The knocks were shy, almost uncertain, and I was preparing to head to my room when something hit the door hard enough to shake it in the frame. I jumped back, not sure what to make of it, and when it hit again, I fell onto my butt and just watched it shake. Whatever was knocking was adamant about getting in, and it slammed its weight into the door again and again. The knob rattled and shook. The lights flashed faster and angrier. My teeth were chattering. This had never happened before, and I was terrified that whatever it was might get through. It slammed into it again, the old wood cracking in the frame. And when it struck this time, I saw something break through the surface and come grabbing blindly from within. It was an arm, a long purple arm covered in scales. It thrashed around trying to find something to grab, and the sounds from within were like bats and birds turned up to 1,000. It shivered right on the edge of hearing, and I expected my ears to start bleeding. It was looking for the knob, and I wasn't sure what would happen if it found it. Instead, it bumped into the knocker. It fell off the door. It was only held on by a couple of screws, and as it clattered onto the floor, the most hellish sound of all ripped through the hole before cutting off as suddenly as it had begun. The lights, the noise, and the banging all stopped with a suddenness that made me dizzy. I stood up, looking at the broken door, and walked slowly into the living room to see the extent of the damage. Something was bumping, but I thought maybe the arm had knocked something over. I wanted to make sure the knocker was okay, but as I came around Grandpa's old chair, I saw what was making all the noise. It was the arm that had come through the door. It was leaking black fluid all over the hardwood and flopping around like a fish. It didn't flop for long, but now I'm left with a problem. The portal only seems to open when the knocker is up, but unless it's up, I can't open it. I wonder if this is why Grandpa kept it with him so often. Did he perhaps have a visitor one night when he least expected it? For now, I'm keeping the knocker in my bedside table, but even as I lay here writing this, I can hear it bumping against the wood every now and again. The money will eventually run out. That or my curiosity will get the better of me, and I'll hang the knocker again. But I think for now I'll let it sit. No need to invite trouble if I don't have to.